I've been waiting for this one, my man. So, like last week, we went into just Hugh Nibley, the man, right? Which was fascinating enough, right? I mean,
Yeah, what a life.
yeah, I was thinking about that dude seen almost everything, right?
Yeah,
His
yeah,
grandfather is rehearsing to him what Brigham Young was like,
right.
fights World War II, sees, I mean, think about this. He dies in '05. So, and I know the last year of his life he was bedridden, but he went from hearing firsthand accounts of Brigham Young to seeing the tragedy of 9/11 in his lifetime.
Yeah,
That's
amazing.
a lot of history.
Yeah, it's a lot for sure.
But now we're going to get into like the meat of what and who he was as we go over his teachings and his discoveries and that sort of stuff. So, man, I'm just excited. I got the permission set so you can share. So let's
Awesome.
jump in.
So, there's no way possible, even as long as we speak, to give adequate representation to 10,000 pages of original essays and thinking. But and of course, I can only present it from my perspective, the things that really appeal to me. So I thought I'd present it as a meal. We have an appetizer. We'll start with the
Nice.
appetizer. Be the I call them the Hugh Nibley zingers. These these short thoughts, these one-liners that have made him so his reputation. He's so direct and he's so astute that he there. I mean, I just call them zingers, right? So we'll go through a number of his zingers. So for those who are not familiar with him at all, you'll get a sense of why he is appreciated, revered, and why the things that he teaches are so memorable, right?
Okay.
Then the main course, it'll take a little bit of time, but I want to give a brief overview, a flyover of all 19 volumes,
I like it.
just to just to present the contents at the
Okay.
very least, so people can see how the breadth of what he wrote about. I mean, it's crazy. And then at the end, to present in some detail my favorite three of my favorite essays.
Okay.
Educating the Saints, where he quotes Brigham Young at length, which gives us a sense of the reverence that he has for the teachings of Brigham Young, and clearly how they kind of are kindred spirits because they kind of think and talk directly in the same way. Then conclude with the two essays that more than anything have stretched my brain in terms
Okay.
of the restored gospel. So we'll
Okay.
do that.
So the zingers are like the appetizer, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So like a good, I don't know, like loaded cheese fries. And so is the main entree going to be more like spiritual smoked brisket? That's what I'm wondering. That's what
Pure steak, baby. Pure
pure. I
steak.
like it. I like it. All right, let's roll. This is going to be great. I'm excited.
And before we have to do a palate cleanser first,
Okay.
which is to say, I wouldn't feel like we have covered him completely if we didn't refute the arguments against him and his work, which will
Okay.
take just a little bit. So, first of all, I begin with this thought, which is Hugh Nibley himself speaking of his work, which gave me a great deal of insight into why he did what he did. He said, I am trying to increase in faith, having become sort of a specialist in evidences for the gospel. Very interesting. He knew that.
Mhm.
He goes on, they turn up everywhere. Some are convincing to others, and some are not. But I am besieged all day long by people seeking reassurance. It is infinitely satisfying to be able to speak to them with absolute assurance.
Mm.
The real knowledge does not come from any source but one. Um, what as in putting this presentation together, what became clear to me the breadth of the topics that he dealt with had to do with the breadth of the questions that he was confronted with on a daily basis because he was teaching college students at Brigham Young.
Right.
And they found in him someone who they could ask any and all of their questions. And he took great pleasure in being able to answer those questions for them. And now we have 19 volumes because of all of those questions.
You know what's interesting about that quote? Do we have the date on that quote by chance?
I suppose we do if I go to the original text.
It's fine. I'll talk here real quick about this. So this has been something that has always interested me. The step between faith to knowledge, right?
Oh, yeah.
Here he seems to be saying something a little bit different, right? He's not talking about faith. He's talking about, I'm besieged all the day long by people seeking reassurance, right?
Yep.
And then he goes, it's infinitely satisfying to be able to speak to them with absolute assurance, the real
Yeah.
knowledge,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Something has happened to Hugh Nibley at before he makes this quote where he has all of a sudden, contrast this to, is there really something on the other side, to now he's like, oh no, this is absolute for sure. This is knowledge. I find that step in people's lives always very fascinating.
This quote comes from a letter to his son, Alex, from June 27th, 1980.
Okay, so it's later
Pretty
on.
late. Pretty
Yep.
late.
Yep. So Hugh Nibley's gotten to a point here to where he's no longer dealing in just matters of faith. Now for him, this has become knowledge. And
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 I
that
see that, yeah, and I see that a part of his thought processes, even from his probably late teens, early 20s, when he was asked if he ever had any doubts. And he said no, except for life after death, because he had no evidence for that,
right.
suggesting that he had very strong evidence for everything else that he believed.
Well, and there was that other quote that you'd shared with me on the first episode where basically he had kind of alluded to the fact that he'd been shown a few things, right?
Hmm.
And then when we look at that, and we know he went through a near death experience, a lot of people
Right.
have those, LDS or otherwise, often come back saying the veil's a little bit thinner now, right? And I've
That's right.
often wondered, especially in books like Enoch the Prophet, right? Where he's
Yeah.
painting that picture of the sons of God living in the highlands and the cities of the wicked below, and how the cities of the wicked are kind of luring in the sons of God down into the cities, right? And
Yeah.
he paints a picture that, quite frankly, I'm like, that seems to be a little more than just the imagination at work here, right? And I've often wondered if the veil didn't get a little thinner for Hugh Nibley after that near death experience, and maybe
Oh,
he
no
can
question.
see things
Yeah.
from time to time that would help him paint the picture for the rest of us.
Well, remember he told his daughter, somebody said, how did you do all of this? And he said, prayer. And then he said, and I had a special arrangement with the other side,
Right,
whatever that means, right?
right.
And speaking of Enoch, you've had some wonderful presentations on Enoch. Sometime I should probably talk about this in private, but we should just take a spin through
Dude,
all three books of Enoch sometime.
we should do that.
I mean, just do it.
I'm
I mean, that
down.
would be fun.
I'm down.
Yeah.
You name the time and place, I'll be there.
Let's see. Mormon Renegade podcast. Give me a month or so.
Right.
That'd be fun. All right. So this first graphic, I imagine you have some sympathy with,
Little bit. Little bit.
right?
I know that feeling. I know that feeling.
Exactly. Exactly. Anyone of any prominence in any organization becomes a target for the adversaries of said organization,
Yeah, oh yeah.
right?
Yep.
Yeah, hello, Joseph Smith, right? And Brigham Young and everybody who falls after that. And the most prominent scholar of the restored gospel is Hugh Nibley.
Right.
Clearly, he's a target. You
Yeah.
understand this, I'm sure.
I
Right?
do.
So it's summarized something like this. Jeff Needle, a non-Latter-day Saint, acknowledges, I am not unaware of the criticisms that have been hurled at Dr. Nibley, both before and after his death, just like Joseph, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that some have questioned the quality of Nibley's scholarship. Did he tend to be sloppy? So he asks three questions. One, did he tend to be sloppy in his research? Were his footnotes a nightmare to verify? And three, did he make stuff up out of whole cloth? All of these charges have been hurled at him, and he makes this statement, which is false. His defenders ignore the charges. Clearly, as we'll see tonight, that is not true. His detractors thrill bringing down the most prominent of Mormon scholars. Most certainly so.
Mm.
Most certainly so, because so few have actually read what he is presenting. Because it's esoteric. It's just out there. Most people don't have access to it.
Well, and he's the first one to do it, right? He's the first one to say,
Yeah.
we're going to take a scholarly approach to Mormonism,
Right.
and we are going to make connections to the ancients in our modern day practice. It's one thing to make claims of angels and a restoration of true Christianity. It's another thing to say, now we're going to prove it by scholarship, right? Because
Yeah.
now you're kind of like, I've always said, you've made someone mad when they start saying you're touching my stuff, right? Um,
Right.
and Hugh Nibley, for the first time ever, didn't see the first guy ever within Mormonism, didn't see a huge problem with like, oh no, I'll touch your stuff, right? Like I think I can totally play with these toys and it's going to be just fine. And so anytime you do that, you buck the trend, yeah, you're going to be a target.
Yeah. Um, so the response, the refutation of the accusation that his sources and his footnotes are sloppy, kind of making stuff up. A guy named James Treadway, I don't know if this was his official title, but he was in charge of managing the production of the whole work, making sure that everything stayed on track. And he would get in there and do some of the footnote verifications himself. And this is what he said, and I loved his perspective. He says, as far as the thousands upon thousands of footnotes that we checked, I'm going to interject here. If you've never read Nibley, you have no concept of how significant his footnotes are, because as he speaks, and a lot of these, by the way, were not presented for publication. They were given as talks or as lectures.
Mm-hmm.
So he is just shooting from the hip, citing these ancient sources, some of which were just newly discovered. And so it would be very easy for even the best scholar to misquote something or to cite it incorrectly, right? As
Mm-hmm.
they're speaking. And as I've said before, most of his essays, the number of pages dedicated to endnotes or footnotes are actually more than the essay itself,
Right.
to show you how deep his citation process is. And the thoughts that he is presenting, the ideas that he is presenting, are based on hundreds and hundreds and thousands of documents in the end. All right. So as far as the thousands upon thousands of footnotes that we checked, I remembered no glaring errors. He would transpose numbers sometimes and that sort of thing. We'll see why. He goes on. I was amazed at the accuracy of his transcriptions as we checked the sources against them.
Hmm.
So Hugh Nibley would because he couldn't have those hundreds and hundreds of documents at his fingertips. He would transcribe them, sometimes translating them to use in his publications or his talks.
So he's actually
Um,
translating
right,
sources at times.
right, or at least just copying. And he's human, so he'll
Right.
find errors here and there. He goes on. I can't imagine how he read so widely, because there were Nibley tracks in so many books in the Harold B. Lee Library. And when they say Nibley tracks, Hugh Nibley did something that he wasn't supposed to do. So he'd be in the library looking at these sources. And when he saw something that appealed to him, he'd take his pencil and make a note in the margin to help him find it again. And they called them Nibley tracks. And it's like this trail of breadcrumbs.
Yeah,
You know that Nibley actually was citing it right here because he left his notation.
that's crazy.
So he says, I can't imagine how he read so widely because there were Nibley tracks in so many books in the Harold B. Lee Library that it seemed no one could have read that much. And that was only one library. That's the one at BYU. He said, when I went to Berkeley to find some of his sources, I found Nibley tracks scattered all over there too. It had
Uh,
been rumored, the rumor was when he was preparing for the defense of his dissertation, that he started on the first floor and went through every book of interest to him, all the way to the top floor of the library, which was many floors, maybe as many as 9. And we got books through interlibrary loan from Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and a bunch of other universities with those same tracks.
holy cow.
So Nibley had been all over those. So was he making stuff up? Absolutely not.
Right.
He had been there. To think, and here's the point that is impressive to me, to think that he typed each quote by hand on a card with that old manual typewriter and indexed them without any computer was mind boggling.
Holy cow.
So not only were they accurate for the most part, what he did borders on the impossible.
Let me ask you this. Do you find any traces in Hugh Nibley's personal writings anywhere that he understands he is breaking ground here?
Sorry, you cut out for a second. What
Do
was
you
that?
no, that's all okay. In any of Hugh Nibley's personal writings, do you find any ideas that maybe he's understanding that he is breaking new ground?
Uh, not. I'm trying to think through what I've read. Not explicitly so, but I think implicit in everything he did, he recognized that he was.
Okay.
I mean, as we will see in his articles, I think abundantly clear. Certainly, the first Latter Day Saint, and certainly the first Latter Day Saint utilizing ancient texts presented to the world, some for the first time, in their relationship to the restored gospel. But
Could,
the statement that we started with, where he said that he takes great pleasure in answering these questions, I think that would be the closest statement I've read where he recognizes the significance of what he's doing. Yeah.
the only reason I ask is there's a lot of documentation on Washington that he understood he was setting the precedent that the
Yeah.
other presidents would have to walk up to.
Yeah.
And so he was always very cognizant of what he was doing. And with these Nibley tracks, as we call them, I wonder if that's not also maybe Nibley showing his work, so to speak, right? Allowing himself to retrace it or allowing others to retrace it in a very tactile kind of way.
I possibly so. Although, considering the difficulty of what he was doing, I think it was just fundamental necessity. I mean, I'm trying to estimate. I've never found a good estimate of how many footnotes he has in the collected works. But we're talking about, let's just do some simple math. 10,000 pages of material, and I would estimate on average 10 footnotes per page. So I was trying to give a rough mathematical estimate, a guesstimate of the number of footnotes that would be involved in 10,000 pages of published material. I would say he averaged between 5 and 10 footnotes per page. So we're talking tens of thousands, between 50,000 and 100,000 footnotes, endnotes, whatever you want to call them, potentially. Can
That
you
is
imagine
insane.
what? And was it a nightmare to track all of those down? Well, of course. There are so many, and the works are so rare for the most part. I mean, they had to go to interlibrary loan to get certain texts were only available from one or two libraries in the nation, right? So, I mean, there were teams of people, and to the credit of the time and the effort to verify his citations and his sources.
Right.
And like I say, for the vast majority of them, they were absolutely spot on.
Holy cow.
So I consider that one refuted.
Oh, absolutely.
Some have suggested the word is parallelomania. A lot of what he did was to find parallels between
Mm.
things that were found in these ancient texts. And we're going to talk about one critic, Douglas Salmon. It was on the forefront of this. And this is how Salmon characterized Hugh Nibley's quote unquote parallelomania. He says, despite the errors he claims to have found in Nibley's writings, critic Douglas F. Salmon admits that, quote, this is not to say that there are no legitimate parallels between documents of the ancient Near East and Latter-day Scripture. In fact, he finds these parallels a truly staggering, undeniable fact. Those are in quotes.
Wow.
So the critic here is admitting, I found a couple of errors, but these parallels are staggering,
Yeah.
and they're undeniable.
Right.
And let me interject here: concordance, meaning if there were no parallels, there'd be nothing in the concordance, right?
Right.
But what I ended up finding was over about 400 pages, and there will be more of these parallels. Talk about staggering, right? And the
Absolutely.
reason I wanted to do that was because instead of just believing Hugh Nibley, those kind of staggering, undeniable parallels I had to see with my own eyes.
Right.
And I found those and many, many, many more
Well, and
going
that's
on.
that's really, I mean, in Hughes Nibley's more I don't want to say scholarly, right? Because everything he did was scholarly.
Sure.
But in his more in-depth works, I mean, that's really what he's doing is just showing you the parallels, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
and for the initiated in Mormonism, they're stark. They pop
Yeah.
out at you. You
Yeah,
know.
they sure do. Yeah. So going on, and indeed, the vast majority of Nibley's parallels in his Enoch studies, let alone his entire literary corpus, are not even examined by Salmon, nor even mentioned. So
Right.
Salmon is making these conclusions about these truly staggering, undeniable parallels without having even gone through the majority of Nibley's works.
Wow.
Going on, thus he is admitting that despite occasional errors and disputed cases, authentic parallels between Latter-day Saint scriptures and ancient writings have indeed been found by Nibley and others. But since he, Salmon, apparently does not wish to consider the possibility that the existence of a parallel in an ancient text can confirm the prophetic insight of Joseph Smith, Salmon attempts to offer an alternative theory to explain the unchallenged parallels. So
Hmm.
this is I love this, and I see this frequently in response to the book, to my book. Serious scholars, when they recognize that these parallels they're legitimate and they can't get around that anymore, the very first thing they rationally try to do, as I would, is to explain how Joseph Smith did that.
Right.
And
Because
listen
he
to what
can't be
Salmon,
what he said he was.
right? That, yeah, angels and gold plates, that's just nuts. Who could
Right.
believe that? And
Hmm.
so, and we talked about Dan Peterson's unbelieving father,
Right.
who finally, after having read some Nibley, looks at his missionary age son and says, could this actually be true?
Right. Right.
When
Well,
presented with the facts, it's like, wow, maybe angels are possible, kind of a thing.
look, it's one of those things, right, where it is such a an amazing story. It is hard to believe, right?
Oh, yeah.
Unless you have for those of us, and everybody I think has to come to this spiritually at some point, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But so yeah, it is a fantastic story, but there's a lot of fantastic stories that are absolutely 100% true.
Oh, yeah. For
And we
sure.
even see that in modern day times. So,
Oh, yeah. Particularly in respect to the cosmos. Mind
right.
blowing,
Yep.
or the microcosm for that matter. Anyway, so Salmon's attempt goes something like this. Well, so he attempts to offer an alternative theory to explain the unchallenged parallels. Thereby, I suspect the person who's speaking here uh, uh, is the late great William Hamblin, one of the people who took up the charge or who inherited the mantle of Hugh Nibley. I love his writings.
Okay.
He says, uh, thereby he suspects tacitly hoping to undermine the historicity of Smith's scriptures, which is ultimately the goal of all critics of the restored gospel. If they can undermine Joseph Smith and figure out some way he was able to do all of this, they can undermine
Mm-hmm.
the truth claims. In the second half of his paper, Salmon offers what he considers a superior alternative to the historical comparative analysis of textual and cultural parallels by turning to Carl Jung's theory of archetypes and the collective consciousness.
And see, I kind of like Carl Jung, right? I do. I think,
Right.
but I wouldn't use him to try to explain Joseph Smith, right? I feel like that's a stretch. Now, granted, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a historian, I don't play one on TV, but man, it seems to me like a stretch, right? I've read a little bit of his stuff, and I don't see how you could explain it. And then this idea of a collective consciousness, right? I look, if we all come from the same source, so to speak, God, there might be something to that, but not in the way I think it's being ascribed here.
uh, in responding to a similar argument on my book Facebook page, one critic was trying to explain it by saying that Joseph Smith was tapping into this cultural understanding of the teachings of Plato, the
No,
Greek.
no. Um,
And Plato did teach some rather extraordinary things. However, as I responded to him, so the teachings of Plato don't even come close to explaining the bullseyes, like specific names of specific biblical characters, specific dates, very specific occurrences and times and priesthoods and on and well, when we talk about temple
right.
rites, names, signs, tokens, all of this stuff, Plato can't explain all of that specificity.
No,
Or as Nibley says about the Book of Mormon names, at least, and he talks about Pearl of Great Price names. What do you say about the guy who comes up with the right ones?
right.
The collective consciousness, that BS. There's no way that
No,
can
no.
happen.
And really, if you looked at Plato, especially because I can only imagine where he's drawing his comparisons to, right? Joseph Smith has this idea of a kind of new society with a Zion type society, right?
Sure.
If you follow what Pluto has talked about, and I believe the term was a plutocracy, right? it's almost a forerunner to Marxism, right? In a lot of ways, right? The state's
Okay.
going to raise your
Yeah.
children.
Oh yeah,
And,
yeah.
and so those kind of things don't hold water. I don't know where else he could be trying to make a connection that, oh no, this is in the the tradition of Plato, right? It just doesn't hold any water.
Well, it gets to the point of the argument of the Occam's razor argument.
Mhm.
The simplest explanation is usually the right one. And Joseph Smith has been trying to tell us this whole time, you know.
Yep. Yep,
God
absolutely.
is real, called me as a prophet, and he did with me what he does with prophets.
Yep.
He reveals things. um, now we have the character assassination attempts. And
Mm,
what kills me about this, and it was prophesied to Joseph Smith, that he would be persecuted and that his name would be had for good and evil throughout for generations throughout the world. And not only, I mean, it wasn't enough for his enemies to assassinate his person.
right.
The attempts continue today, and they continued shortly after his death. Some of the very same people who were responsible for his physical assassination to continue to assassinate his reputation and his character.
Right.
The same is true of poor Hugh. And you'll see the name John Sorensen here. John Sorensen was the most qualified and the first real pioneer of Book of Mormon geography. And so people are trying to take them both out with one fell swoop by claiming this. It is not uncommon to hear people say that Hugh Nibley and John Sorensen were not real, respectable scholars, that supposedly no one outside of Mormons have ever heard of them or read their scholarship. So they were famous within their little small circle of Mormons, right?
Right.
So the person who wrote this, Neil Rapelye, who's a contemporary LDS scholar, says, so to help put their careers in perspective for people from my generation, I list here a non-comprehensive bibliography of the works by Hugh Nibley and John Sorensen in non-LDS venues. So we're talking about juried, peer-reviewed
Sure.
publications. And I left out the ones for John Sorensen because we're not talking about him today. And there they are. I had to make the print really, really small so they would all fit.
Western Political Quarterly.
Yeah. So they date starting in 1949 and go clear up to, I think it's 1976. And there are a number of them. So the Western Political Quarterly, the Historian, the Western Political, again,
Jewish Quarterly. Holy,
and halfway down the left hand side, Der Stern, the German publications in 59, the Jewish Quarterly, yeah, Church History Studies and Christianity and Culture. He was published a lot, significantly,
holy cow.
in publications that, no, were not the Ensign.
Right. Holy cow.
So was he a real scholar? Yes, he was. And
Citing biblical
it,
literature. Holy cow.
it was said both of him and John Sorensen that people were afraid to debate them because they knew too much.
Right. Whew.
In fact, I
Paints Hugh
this is
Nibley in a little bit different picture when you start seeing like purely academic and then he's quoting his work.
exactly. Uh, I have them. What was his name? Michael Coe, I think. Um, I think he's still alive. One of the world's preeminent Mayanists, who's an expert in Mayan history, and he made the mistake once of criticizing Book of Mormon claims. John Sorensen, who by then was retired, published an open letter to Michael Coe, giving him the smackdown.
Really?
Yeah, and Coe, I don't know that Coe ever responded, but Coe has publicly stated that John Sorensen, and I'm deviating, but just to give you an idea, uh, has published some groundbreaking work that is changing our understanding of Mesoamerican history. So
We'll have to get
Now,
one on that one day because it sounds like you're kind of familiar with Sorensen.
oh yeah, I'm a big fan.
Okay.
Big fan.
We'll put that one in the bank for later too.
Yeah. The next thing we're going to discuss will be the low point of our conversation tonight.
Okay.
It's the saddest thing
Yeah.
to discuss, and I think it demonstrates the lengths to which the adversary will go to target the righteous and those who are dedicated to serving the kingdom. The woman that you see there is Hugh Nibley's youngest daughter, Martha Nibley Beck. This is taken straight out of Wikipedia. Nibley's daughter, Martha Beck, published Leaving the Saints, How I Lost the Mormons and Found My Faith in 2005. Why is that year significant?
It's the year he died, right?
The year he died. Describing her departure from the LDS Church and claiming in 1990 she had recovered repressed memories of her childhood sexual abuse by her father, Hugh Nibley.
Wow.
Beck linked the abuse to her father's role as an apologist for the Mormon faith. Of course she would. He's abusing her because he was defending the faith. Wow, that makes perfect sense. The book was condemned by the LDS Church, of course. The allegations received national publicity, of course. Nibley had long been aware of the allegations and, of course, denied them. They had 8 children, right?
Right.
Hugh and Phyllis. Beck's 7 siblings responded, noting about half the Nibley siblings had left the LDS Church already or were not active in Mormonism. And most had taken issue with elements of their father's personality or habits, but were unified in their rejection of Beck's claims.
Hmm.
So all 7 of the other siblings were like, no, that never happened. Despite the fact that they weren't defending the church because half of them weren't in the church, right?
Right.
And they all knew their dad was perfect, but they were like, no, that never happened. And I'm going to insert here her older sister. That I posted a photo of their house in the previous presentation. Very modest home, very modest. I'm probably not 2,000 square feet, and 8 people packed in there. Martha, and I think it was Zina Nibley, shared a bed growing up, a bunk bed. How on earth? And the accusation was that Nibley would dress up in Egyptian robes and go in and sexually abuse her like some sort of perverted Egyptian rite, which completely, I mean, goes so against this consecrated life that he led. It's unimaginable. And how would he be able to do that if Zina was in the bed beneath?
Right.
And they said that the walls of the house were paper thin. It was built in 55. That sort of thing could have happened at all,
No, look, here's the
right?
thing, right? When someone starts talking about repressed memories that are extracted through, I'm only assuming, I'm just
Hypnotism, recovered memories through
hypnotism.
hypnosis. Yeah.
I'm not going to line up and lend credibility to that. And let me tell you why. Because hypnotism relies on you being in a suggestive state, right? And so if she's already disgruntled with the church slash gospel, she wants out. This is the most convenient narrative, right? And if she has a hypnotist who is sympathetic to her cause, those sorts of things can be completely implanted. And that's
Yeah.
if it goes that far and it's just not out full out fabrication, right?
Yeah.
We've seen people do far worse for probably less money.
Yeah. So I'll add some more stuff. I'll finish the quote here. Um, in a review of Leaving the Saints for Sunstone magazine, Tanya Rands Lyon noted many internal consistencies in Beck's narrative that argued against the abuse claims. and was put off by the relentless negative view of Mormonism. Lyon also noted how Beck originally intended for the manuscript to be a novel, but changed it to be an autobiography at her publisher's suggestion.
There you go.
Now, the other things that were not pointed out in this article, Martha married a faithful LDS guy that she met while in graduate school back east somewhere, I forget. And they had 3 children together. And then he comes out as being gay.
Mm.
And then she comes out as being gay. And then these repressed, recovered memories happen. And I can't help but try to understand how, and especially from our previous discussion, it was abundantly clear that Hugh Nibley adored his children. He loved them,
Mm-hmm.
changed their diapers, took them hiking. And his one daughter, I think it was Christina, maybe, who spoke of him in such glowing terms that I'm envious as a father. I hope my daughter, the sweetest, the kindest, funniest, wittiest, wisest, most loving man she has ever known. How could one daughter say something like that and another daughter say something like this? The the inconsistency is irreconcilable.
No, absolutely. And look, here's the other thing, right? I believe you said half of his children weren't active in the gospel,
Correct.
right? I mean, I, again, we all try our hardest with our kids, but at the end of the day, they're still
Sure.
people and they're all going to make their own decisions, right?
Right. Lehi, right. Joseph,
Right.
right.
Heavenly Father, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
right. Heavenly Father.
let's go down the list here. But the fact that half of his kids aren't active and say he was a great dad, right? I mean that says something here, right? And again, the whole let me put you under hypnosis and we'll get to the bottom of things kind of thought, not really a big a, it's not really a huge selling point to me anyway.
Yeah. And probably to finish this up, I just because of the fact that she is his child, I can't help but want to understand what's going on and why.
Right.
And I'm no psychologist, and I'm going to refrain from being an armchair psychologist, but I watched a number of videos. She's quite she has a lot of stuff out there because she works for Oprah, or at least did, I think, publishing for the O magazine, and Oprah promoting many of her books. I mean, she's a doc. She has a doctorate in psychology or sociology, one of those two, and it does a lot of self help of people being true to themselves, sort of thing. And she has a number of podcasts and videos, and the videos are self explanatory in terms of what's important to her.
Gotcha.
She's very open and proud on her videos of her sexuality, and is proud of what she referred to as a thruple in one case, and openly mocks Mormonism and Latter-day Saint beliefs and practices. So, but the thing that breaks my heart is poor Hugh Nibley, you know, in
Yeah.
his last years, being treated like this and being accused like this by his own flesh and blood, his own daughter. I mean, it wouldn't take much for you and I to imagine the scar that would leave.
That's just heartbreaking. I mean, for anybody who's a father, I can only imagine the heartbreak that must cause and the absolute angst that
And
he
I, and
must
I
have
think,
felt.
right, and clearly Martha is dealing with psychological burdens of her own.
Right,
Um, and I would hope and pray that when she exits this life and is free from the burdens of
right.
that she and her father can embrace and reconcile. At
Absolutely.
least at least there. All
Absolutely.
right. Here come the appetizers.
All right, we're off to the meal now.
Um, to preface this, Elder Neil Maxwell was a great, he was a beloved apostle, quite a scholar himself, quite eloquent. Um, Characterized Hugh Nibley this way. Hugh, of course, is above the fray, not in the sense of his being esoteric or highly advanced, but because his commitment is so visible and has been so pronounced and so repetitively stated that that's not even the issue. So then we get on to what is Hugh saying? So the almost the implicit trust the church leadership had for Hugh Nibley, this is why.
Right.
Anyway,
They didn't have to wonder about his motivations, is what he's saying there.
that's right. And it helps me understand the title of his biography written by his son-in-law. I mean, his children just love the man. In any case, it the biography is called Hugh Nibley, A Consecrated Life. His
Right.
life was consecrated unto the kingdom of God. And here we go. This is from the Essential Nibley in the preface, page 15. A research assistant once saw him, Hugh Nibley, bent over the Book of Mormon, laughing. Nibley explained that he had discovered an error, that Alma had said that all mankind is carnal, sensual, and devilish by nature. He said that Alma should have written that mankind is carnal, sensual, devilish, and stupid. You gotta love that. But he was laughing about it
Yep.
because of his perspective. He knew that. This is from Approaching Zion, which you've mentioned before, page 44. And I want your thoughts on that when we get there. Aristotle pointed out long ago that a shortage of knowledge is an intolerable state, and so the mind will do anything to escape it. In particular, it will invent knowledge if it has to. Or as I think I've read elsewhere, he put it this way: in the absence of truth, men invent knowledge,
Yeah.
which is not a good thing.
No.
You see
No.
that a whole lot in academia.
Ooh. You know, boy, there's a ton of things that can apply to,
Oh, I
right?
think every single discipline.
Yep. I look at that, and you can even look at that at maybe the more heavy-handed um climate agenda, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I think this also speaks, and I think it's something that Nibley's pointed out in several places, not like I'm going to quote it or say it here. Man, I think all men are naturally religious, right? It's not a matter if you're going to be religious. It's just a matter of which God you want to worship, right? And so often I think that things like the extreme left on the side of climate change or being woke or any of those other things, it's got all the hallmarks of a religion, right? And so when men say, no, 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 I'm not religious, I tend to say, no, I think you probably are. You just don't understand it, but you definitely have some sort of God that you adhere to,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You may
We all
not
have
think of
belief
it.
systems. Yeah.
Yeah, you may not have an idea of a divine being, but you probably have some theology that you espouse.
Yeah. Approaching Zion again. Here on this perilously exposed little planet, battered by solar winds from one side and cosmic rays from the other, while seething inwardly with unimaginable heat and pressure, we somehow find ourselves in an ambience peculiarly congenial to our comfort and convenience, as if somebody actually had us in mind. His sarcasm drives me nuts. I mean, it's so obvious. Oh, almost as if someone had us in mind, right?
I've mentioned my buddy on here before who is a physics major and decided to become a land surveyor of all things. Um,
Yeah.
but he had once said, I'm not sure who or what God is, but there's something divine. because the science of statistic probability says we should have been peppered with big asteroids by
Oh,
now.
yeah. Well, and the science says we have been. The question is, how are we still alive here?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. The Dead Sea Scrolls, this is from Since Cumorah. The Dead Sea Scrolls show us that the text of the Bible has not been so much altered, for actually showed us that it has been on the whole preserved with astonishing integrity, as mutilated by the removal of material from the original. So he
Mm,
sums up, and we say we believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly, and some people misinterpret that to say that we have the Bible, but the words are wrong. He's saying that's not what the Dead Sea Scrolls are showing us. The Dead Sea
right.
Scrolls are showing us that what we have is accurate. The problem is the removal of entire books and sections from the original, which
Yeah.
is exactly what Joseph Smith gave us with like the
Yep.
Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham, and
Mm.
the Enoch sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. By the way,
Oh boy.
what I
Oh
had
boy.
pictured in the
Seer
photograph,
stones. Seer stones. Oh boy.
too, we have the brown seer stone and the white seer stone, which are not the Urim and Thummim that was given in the spectacles that was given to Joseph by the angel Moroni. These are two different stones that we know that he possessed. And I have a dear friend. She's Joseph Smith's great great granddaughter,
Okay.
I believe. Gracia Jones, one of his first descendants who were actually baptized into the LDS Church. Gracia and Gracia Jones. She's so sharp. She's amazing. She comes to my gospel doctrine class. One day we were
Impressive.
talking about these seer stones, and I was telling them that the church is actually the photograph on the top is the actual stone the church has in its possession. They published a photograph of it.
Mm-hmm.
The bottom one is a rendering. It's a painting of what we would assume the white stone looks like. And I said, and I was telling the class, we know where the brownstone is. The white one, we don't know exactly where that is. And Gracia raised her hand. She says, I know where it is. After she was baptized, she was given access uh, to the vault in the prophet's office, the first presidency,
Oh
where
wow.
they keep things that the public do not have access to. And because of her standing and her recent conversion, and she told me in the class, she said, I hadn't even considered it. She was so new to the gospel, she didn't even know what she was doing. She
Right.
didn't, but on that day, she put two and two together. So this is like 40 years later. This was in the 60s after she'd been baptized. They took her in the vault, and her friend, guide, took the brown seer stone and the white seer stone and placed them in each of her hands.
Wow.
She held them both. Can
Holy cow.
you believe that? I was like,
Woo.
here she is sharing them with my class. That is so cool. I had to pinch myself.
You could have probably just wrapped it up right then, right? You could have probably been like, this
I
may have been,
probably should have. Yeah.
yeah, this is the pinnacle. I would have definitely just been like, well, good night, everybody. This has been fun.
I think I sat there like my mouth hanging open for about 5 minutes, trying to consider all the implications of what she had said. Anyway, I love how Hugh Nibley, and he does so concisely, gives us understanding of the purpose of seer stones. He says, this is from the message of the Joseph Smith Papyri. A Urim and Thummim, like a dictionary, is only an aid to the translator who knows how to work it and may be gradually dispensed with as he becomes more proficient in his spiritual exercise.
Mm.
This is from the prophetic Book of Mormon. Before the finger of the Lord touched the 16 stones of the brother of Jared, they were mere pieces of glass. And they probably became so after they had fulfilled their purpose. In themselves, these objects were nothing. They did not work by magic. The aids and implements that God gives to men work on no magic or automatic or mechanical principle, but only according to the faith and diligence and heed which we give unto them, and ceased to work because of wickedness.
Mm-hmm.
Or as I've said, what's a seer stone without a seer? A stone.
Yep.
From
Yep.
Approaching Zion again. Joseph Smith has placed in our hands fragments of writings from the leaders of all the major dispensations, and now, only in very recent times, has the world come into possession of whole libraries of ancient texts against which his purported scriptures can be tested. And
Mm,
that's the summation of his parallelism. And the photograph there is of the Nag Hammadi Library that
wow.
was discovered on the banks of the Nile River the exact same year the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. What?
Holy cow.
That's crazy. Approaching Zion again. It is the weakness of the flesh in both cases, money and sex, to prove our spirits stronger than the pull of matter, to assert our command over the new medium of physical bodies before proceeding onward to another state of existence.
Wow.
That's an incredible perspective of what mortality, of what its purpose is.
You know, in that I find a lot of hope, right? Look, as we're young people, it's very hard to bridle
Oh yeah, for
those
sure.
urges and passions, right?
Yeah.
And in here we find that this is this is what this life is for. Learning to bridle those and use them in healthy ways. And this is one of those things I would share with someone who is struggling with that, right? Like, look, just keep working at it. You got some time. Don't panic, but let's hurry up and get this taken care of, sort of a thing.
Yeah, at least to give some perspective, to
Yep.
acknowledge, I mean, testosterone,
Oh yeah.
people who aren't guys have a really hard time understanding. I mean, I'll confess here and now, that's been the only real struggle of my life,
Hmm.
really. Substance abuse and that sort of stuff, it never really had any appeal to me. But the burden of testosterone is something that without the restored gospel, and as we talked about before, I shudder to think what I might have become.
Right.
That, I mean, because unchecked, unguided, testosterone will lead to a life of debauchery. I mean, that's what you do. And
Absolutely.
so this view of mortality and the primary answer is, we come to Earth to get a body. That's the beginning of the answer,
Right.
right? In the world of spirits, we mastered spirit matter. But to
Right.
become like God, we also had to become masters of physical matter.
Yep.
And then, as the scriptures tell us, when we're resurrected, the physical and the spiritual will be reunited
Yes.
permanently. Anyway, to become like God. He goes on. This is from The World and the Prophets. Scientists insist that the evidence speaks for itself, only to discover that it speaks with different voices to different scientists.
That's pretty good. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a zinger, that one. This is one of my favorites from his New Look at the Pearl of Great Price. What on earth have a man's name, degree, academic position, and of all things, opinions to do with whether a thing is true or not?
That's a good point. That is a very, very good point.
This is typical of his humility. He says, well, I have a testimony. I may be ignorant, but I am not lost.
Hmm.
From
There you go.
Since Camorra. Implicit and explicit in the concept of a gospel taught by degrees instead of all at once, precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little and there a little, is the idea that the most important, the highest, and the holiest teachings come last.
Mm. Lays out the pattern.
And
Leading
look, there's my temple.
Yep.
Woo! I love that place. Okay. Beyond politics. God does not fight Satan. A word from him, and Satan is silenced and banished. There is no contest there. In fact, we are expressly told that all the power which Satan enjoys here on earth is granted him by God. Quote, we will allow Satan, our common enemy, to try men and to tempt him, unquote. It is man's strength that is being tested, not God's.
Absolutely. Hmm.
From Brigham Young and the Enemy. In dealing with this particular enemy, the enemy of all righteousness, the first rule is never to use his methods, speaking of the devil, for if we do, he has already won. He doesn't care which side we are on as long as we act like devils.
Boy, there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. I am not a big fan of the idea that the ends justify the means.
Oh, no, no, no. Yeah, that's a
Right?
scary,
That's a
yeah, that's a
very
slippery slope.
scary place, right? And I'm always very cognizant of of this idea that whatever it takes we'll do in order to get the end goal. Because on the way to that, you can justify a lot of nasty things. Um, and oftentimes that's first accompanied with an idea that God's on our side, right? It's
Oh,
interesting.
yeah.
If you
Oh,
look
yeah.
if you look at it at national if you look at American history, the founders start out with this idea of divine providence, right?
Right,
And if you begin to dive in and tear that apart, and what that means is through things like edicts from state governors saying, we're going to have a day of fasting and humiliation, right? Before
right,
God Almighty. There's a sense of they were trying to be on God's side. Now, if you contrast that with manifest destiny, there's a sense with manifest destiny that no, God's on our side, right?
right, right,
And
right.
justify the means now because God is on our side. So we
Yeah,
have
we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, right?
exactly, and you can do
Say the
a lot of
Nephites. Yeah,
horrific stuff. Now, look, I want to say I'm a fan of westward migration, but I think we could have done that a lot more humanely than
clearly. Yeah,
that sort of thing. And so I think Nibley really touches on something good here that it's more than just about quote winning, right? There's
yeah.
more to it than that.
But I just love how he puts it. It's almost funny how he says it.
Yep,
Satan doesn't care which side you're on as long as you act like devils,
absolutely.
which most often happens on both sides.
Yep.
From the best possible test. Yet the moment I even think of my priesthood as a status symbol or a mark of superiority, it becomes a mere hollow pretense.
Hmm.
At the slightest hint of gloating or self congratulation, the priesthood holder is instantly and automatically unfrocked.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
From Message of the Joseph Smith Papyri. One of the most puzzling episodes in the Bible has always been the story of Jacob's wrestling with the Lord. When one considers that the word conventionally translated by wrestled, Yevek, can just as well mean embrace, and that it was in this ritual embrace that Jacob received a new name and the bestowal of priestly and kingly power at sunrise, the parallel to the Egyptian coronation embrace becomes at once apparent. To
Where
say,
in Mormonism have I seen a new embrace and a new name? Gosh, if only I could remember.
I
Oh,
have no idea what you're talking about.
no idea what I'm talking
Yeah,
about. No.
I mean, I felt the same. I mean, why would Jacob wrestle? That just seems childish to me.
Right.
Oh, it was an embrace. Of course it would be. from his essay Before Adam. It's sad to think how many of those telling points of evolution that turned some of our best students away from the gospel have turned out to be dead wrong. Then he takes that further. This essay Before Adam, again, was in answer to students' questions. He finally dove in and tackled it. He said, don't begrudge the existence of creatures that looked like men long ago, or deny them a place in God's affection, or even a right to exaltation. For our scriptures allow them such. Don't be overly concerned with just when and where they might have lived, for their world is not our world. They have all gone away. They have all left the house on the hill long before our people ever appeared. God assigned them a proper time and season, as well as their proper sphere, and predesignated the earth and other earths for multi-purpose occupancy.
You know, my buddy Sean Anderson, shout out to him, shared with me a quote from Joseph Smith, a quote that was attributed to him. And I can't remember who the gentleman was that he was speaking to, but Joseph basically on a starry night was kind of expounding as he often did. And he said something to the effect of the words world and earth are not
Are not
synonymous,
synonymous
right?
terms.
And that
Yeah.
a world refers to a planet that is inhabited. So therefore, a single planet, and I'm paraphrasing here, a single planet could have many worlds upon it, right?
Exactly.
And and
Exactly.
and Hugh Nibley here is reiterating the same sentiment that Joseph Smith expressed.
Exactly. I love Joseph Smith never taught young earth creationism.
Nope.
Never. From the very beginning. So Latter-day Saints, and we get caught up in this, as the earth existed for 6,000 years. Well, not according to Joseph Smith.
Do,
He's saying the earth has existed for at least 2.555 billion years.
okay, now I'm going to say something here, and this is going to make a lot of people angry, and I apologize for this.
Hooray!
But
Go, David.
I'm gonna say something here that quite frankly has irritated many people, but it's something I believe to my core. And I have friends who are evangelical Christians, and I love them, right? But we are not the same in our theology. And
Nope.
for too long, I have seen all branches of Mormonism, not just LDS, not just fundamentalists, um, try to attain that forever golden cup of the title of Christian. You know what? You can have that. Joseph Smith was onto something different, right? Very Christ-centered still, and Christian in its strictest interpretation, but it's very different, right? And sometimes I think that we end up grasping at some of those things that we see our evangelical Christian brothers and sisters that they have, and we think, well, okay, that makes sense. And if we embrace that, then we can be the same. We can be Christians, right? And I'm like, stop worrying about that label. Just stop. Because quite frankly, sometimes we end up importing things that contradict the dispensation head by reaching for that label too often.
Yeah, speaking for the other side of that argument, Latter-day Saints love Christ so
Absolutely.
deep, so deeply that when someone tells us you're not a Christian, it hurts. It's offensive when we're like,
Sure.
"Yes, we are. How dare you?"
Sure.
And and I think they make the mistake. I mean, your point is valid. We don't want to gut our beliefs to try and be the same. That's not the point. But they're so and rightfully preoccupied with what Joseph Smith um, expanded
Mm-hmm.
Christianity to mean that they forget that the fundamental aspects of Christianity, that he is the savior of the world without whom we are all lost.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, Mormons believe that too, fundamentally, in many respects more than you. Anyway,
Right.
yeah, good point. From No
Okay.
Ma'am, that is not history.
Time
Yes,
out. Time out. I got to know. Do you think that picture is Joseph Smith?
I think I do now. From a
Okay.
very recent conversation I had with his great granddaughter, Gracia Jones, and her son, David Denning, uh, because that came from, oh my gosh, it was from her relative, not LDS, and who had no dog in the fight. And it was clearly Emma's locket.
Okay.
And I haven't had any revelation on it, but I really want it to be.
I'm
I
like
love,
you. I'm
I
like
really
you.
love the fact that Joseph Smith uh, was rugged. He would have to be.
Yep. Yep. I'm like you. I really think it probably is, but more than think, I really want it to be.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, this this brings something else up, right? That I had read, oh, I want to say better part of a year ago. And that was this idea that there's a possibility, given where Joseph was born and where he lived for a while, he could have had kind of a New Englander accent,
Yeah.
which would have, I think, completely shocked us today.
Or I wouldn't you have loved to hear John Taylor speak
Yes.
his proper English accent? That would be so cool.
Yep, absolutely. Anyway, sorry, sidebar.
No, no. So, no, ma'am, that's not history. Is his refutation of Fawn Brody's "No Man Knows My History," and he sums some ideas up here by saying some kind of an inspired super evil might not have got away with some of the things he did, but no blundering, dreaming, undisciplined, shallow, and opportunistic faker could have left behind what Joseph Smith did, both in men's hearts and on paper.
Mm,
I think it
interesting.
was supposed to read Super Evil Genius. Yeah. And this is the same thing that I and others have said about his work. When you look at the facts, you left behind what Joseph Smith did in men's hearts and on paper. Look at the hard facts. No
Right.
one, no faker could have done
Absolutely.
that. It's no small feat simply to have picked a lot of strange and original names out of the air. But what shall we say of the man who was able to pick the right ones?
So when I had Michael Ness on for, I want to say, our first episode on the Old Testament, he pointed out that there is a lot of similarities to names that have seemed to have been kind of Hebrew names that seem to have been Egyptianized, I guess, for lack of a better term, in the Book of Mormon, right? Um, Ammon being one, close to Amun, uh,
Nephi,
which is close to
Nephi,
Ammon.
which,
Yep.
yeah,
Um, uh,
Psalm,
Mosiah, another
yeah,
one.
yeah.
Um, Harkening back to Moses. It's fascinating when you start looking at the parallels in that for sure.
What we find are Book of Mormon names that show some Hebrew,
Yep.
Egyptian, Babylonian, and Phoenician naming practices. Why, that's ridiculous. People
Yep.
coming out of Hebrew would never name their children after their conquering heroes.
Right.
But when we find, oh my gosh, the Lachish letters, these broken shards at these Hebrew outposts, which
Right.
were basically these clay tablets with all these records on them, that's exactly what we found.
Did
They date to the same time period as Lehi, but for whatever reason, the Hebrews are naming their kids after the heroes of their conquerors.
let me ask you this. Do do we ever have any sort of real idea what Lehi maybe did for a living?
I have read a number of things. The fact that he was fluent in what we would call Demotic, which is Egyptian shorthand. The fact that their family had wealth, the fact that they were comfortable in the desert and had desert regalia to be able to live and survive in the desert. The fact that they knew the incense trail that went south from Jerusalem, and the fact that they had precious metals and knew how to work precious metals would indicate that they were indeed traders.
That's kind of what I had heard too. I and I think the reason that's important in this little snippet is the fact that you would expect to see that in Book of Mormon names, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's going to be the language that, quite frankly, was universal to all.
The other crazy thing about the Book of Mormon names is not only are they bona fide ancient names, but in the for whatever reason in the Book of Mormon, the name matches the role that the named character is playing, like
Yep.
a hero or a general or something like that. And Hugh Nibley has a whole list of that. That's another conversation. From Approach to the Book of Mormon, he says, no one can know too much about the Book of Mormon, period.
Very good.
This is one of my favorites. The gas law of learning. Any amount of information, no matter how small, will fill any intellectual void, no matter how large.
That's one of those where you're like, okay, no, I can see that. Yep.
He was merciless on academia. He had issues. Which brings us to the main
The
course,
main
the
course.
19 volumes.
Nice.
First volume one, Old Testament and Related Studies, was published in 1986. Has 11 essays, historicity of the Bible. Ooh, archaeology and our religion, myths and scriptures, before Adam, patriarchy and matriarchy. And number six, the one we're going to hit tonight. This is for last, if we have any brain power left, because oh, it's amazing. Unrolling the Scrolls, Some Forgotten Witnesses. Number seven, we'll cover this one, Treasures in the Heavens. Number eight, Greater the Words of Isaiah. Nine, More Voices from the Dust. 10, Dead Sea Scrolls. Qumran Companions.
Wow.
Even in that volume alone, he's talking about prehistoric humanoids,
Yep.
uh, patriarchy, matriarchy, Dead Sea Scrolls, and many, many other ancient texts and the historicity of the Bible. That all by itself would be a landmark publication.
Absolutely.
Volume 2, Enoch the Prophet, also published in 1986. Four essays, Enoch the Prophet, the Enoch figure, the Book of Enoch as a theodicy, and for a strange thing in the land, the return of the Book of Enoch, which he deals with quite wonderfully. And I can't wait for that conversation. I mean, it's one thing to talk about these books of Enoch,
Yep.
but to read what they say
Oh,
is
like
amazing to me.
I am still convinced that as Mormons, we should be paying way more attention to Enoch. Um, because let's face it, what is kind of the end goal of Mormonism? It's to be able to build Zion, right?
Oh yeah.
That's what we're after. That's what we're about. And certainly we can point to Melchizedek, but really Enoch's the guy that kind of shows
Oh yeah.
done, right?
No question about it.
And I really believe that Enoch and the writings that surround Enoch, it does take some discernment to extract what's what in there, whether it's figurative, whether it's just a flat mistake by scribes, whatever the case may be. Nonetheless, there are gems there for us to
Well, and
get.
I found they're far more approachable and understandable than a person would ever think.
Yep, absolutely.
And the three Enoch, first, second, third Enoch, they're completely different texts. They're not a copy of the same text.
Right.
There's a fourth called the Book of Giants from the Dead Sea Scrolls that people make a whole lot of noise about, but they're so fragmentary. There's not a lot that it says other than confirming the giants were a part of their theology.
Right.
Anyway, oh boy, that'll be awesome. Volume three, The World and the Prophets, came out in 1987.
Mm,
Every single one, 25 essays, all talking about the role of prophets.
man.
Oh my gosh. Volume four, one of my favorites, Mormonism and early Christianity.
Yes.
So are we keeping track of all the things he's writing about so far?
No,
So volume four
my
now,
brain, no, my brain's already tapioca.
right?
But we're
9 essays, early accounts of Jesus' childhood, the 40-day mission of Christ. What? My mind, my mind, I think, burst into flames when I realized that there's a whole body of early Christian literature that deals specifically, almost exclusively, with the 40 days he tarried with his disciples after his resurrection, about which the New Testament says practically nothing.
right.
Guess what I went out and started buying? 40-day literature.
Right.
Wow. Those are my favorite pieces, I think. Number three, the early Christian prayer circle. Hello.
Mm,
Number
yep.
four, baptism for the dead in ancient times. Given time, we would have covered those. Passing of the primitive church, way of the church, Jerusalem and early Christianity. What is a temple? And Christian envy of the temple. I've often said to people, and I'm having conversations with evangelicals and my other Christian friends that question our belief in the necessity of a temple. I said, you're preoccupied with us not having a temple. If I were you, I'd be concerned about why don't we have a temple,
Right.
considering its preeminence
Yep.
in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the fact that it's prophesied that there would be temples in the future.
Yep.
Yeah, Christ was not the end of that. Volume 5, Lehi in the Desert, the world of the Jaredites, and there were Jaredites. And here we have 17 plus the appendices, 19 amazing essays, which talks about the practices of the ancient Arabic the desert traditions, the world of the Jaredites, talking about the time right after the flood. And part three, there were Jaredites, as talking about the old world relative to that time period, 2000, 2200 BC. And the appendices, East Coast or West Coast, and how far to Cumorah. I mean, I love these. He gives them these pithy titles that make you want to read them. Are we getting an idea of how far ranging his research
He
was?
just, there was nothing. That's the other thing I love about Nibley. There's nothing off limits.
That's right. Yeah.
There's nothing that is not worthy of scrutiny and of research, right? Everything's on the table for Nibley.
As he said, you can't know too much about the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Volume 6, An Approach to the Book of Mormon, came out in 1988, which has 30 chapters.
Okay. So I got to know because I was not a Mormon during this time, right? Um, when these are coming out, Ken, do you remember waiting for them to come out? I mean, would you hear about rumblings about, there's a new Nibley book on the way? I mean, what was that like as
Sadly, this was pre-internet.
hmm
I mean, this was very early on. I'm trying to think what I was doing in '88. I got my first word processor, which was not even connected to what the internet was,
right,
in like 1990 when I was doing my master's work, and I thought it was magical.
right.
Had my first IBM computer in 91, 92, and my first internet computer probably mid 90s, 96.
Yep.
I thought I had a Urim and Thummim, baby. That was amazing. Um, so it was hard to keep up with what was being published without getting those farms publications.
Okay.
And and especially at that time, as Jack Welch noted, it was a big deal within the intellectual circle, but outside there was really no way to let people know, you know.
Gotcha.
Um, Once the whole set was finished and you could see him in full color, I mean, people started to get
Get
a little more
excited.
excited about it, and especially with the internet, that became a big thing.
Gotcha.
So, well, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, my life then, I was so up to my neck in academic work, trying to pursue my degrees and the like, that my fact, I remember writing to my a dear friend from high school when I finished my dissertation. I was so excited that I could dive back into the stuff I really love the most, the
Right.
study of the restored gospel of Hugh Nibley. So, Volume 6, An Approach to the Book of Mormon, uh, came from, in 1957, Church Curriculum Committee and the First Presidency asked Hugh Nibley to write the priesthood manual for 1957.
And that's what an approach to the Book of Mormon is, right?
That is what this approach to the so what you're looking at here is a list of the lessons for the year.
Whew.
Oh, Lehi's world, Lehi's affairs, Lehi and the Arabs. I mean, these are history lessons.
Yeah.
The doomed city, politics in Jerusalem, a portrait of Laban, the meaning of the wilderness, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Book of Mormon being taught in priesthood meeting. Hello,
Wow.
life in the desert, ties between the old world and the new. Now we're talking about archaeology and priesthood meeting. Proper names in the Book of Mormon. Strange ships and shining stones. Talking about the Jaredites.
A not so fantastic story.
He's always so funny.
You know,
So go ahead.
this book, well, I haven't read it all the way through. I often refer to it. And oftentimes, as I've read it, I've thought to myself, is this what the school of the prophets look like? Right? Is this, could this be kind of some of the stuff? I mean, not necessarily the content, right? Because some of the content wasn't discovered, but this kind of dives into history and politics and those sorts of things, right? Because you do get a definite flavor, especially when you start talking about the history. What, how do you put it? The history of the political of the political history of Jerusalem or something.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I just find it fascinating, right? He's operating at a different level than everybody else. And I've
Yep.
often thought, is there a certain hearkening back that's taking place here?
Speaking of the school of the prophets and what they would study, as I've said before, my in-laws are fundamentalists,
Hmm.
part of a fundamentalist sect in southern Utah that not FLDS, just make that clear. And I'm friends with many people who I'm not necessarily related to by marriage. And one day, one of these friends was showing me around the mansion that one of their apostles, I guess I would call them, lives in, and showed me their library. Which I mean, and this place is amazing. It has indoor balconies and a ballroom, and it's an
Wow.
amazing home. And on the second floor, where one of the balconies overlooks the ballroom, is the library. And I looked in the I love looking at people's libraries. And I look at the library and there are Hugh Nibley everywhere, multiple copies of Temple and Cosmos. And I says, "What's this all about?" And he says, "This is where the leadership, the brethren, meet, and this is what they're studying, Temple and
Interesting.
Cosmos." And I'm like, "Yeah, boy, that's how we do
Hmm.
it." Yeah. So here's the story of this 1957 priesthood manual. The photograph is of a young uh,
David O. McKay.
David O. McKay rocking the gentle stash. When Nibley wrote an approach to the Book of Mormon as the 1957 priesthood manual, the committee turned down every chapter. But President McKay overruled the committee on every chapter. He said that if it's over the brethren's heads, let them reach for it. He left every chapter just as I had it. That's
Mm,
Hugh Nibley speaking. The committee fumed at the mouth and protested, "We can't have it." President McKay turned right around and said, "We jolly well can have it. Let them work at it a little."
good for him.
So, my early impression my ignorant impression of Hugh Nibley was that because he had his head in the clouds intellectually, that he had no patience or time nor interest in all the poor rest of us who are trying to get enough milk so that we can start consuming the meat of what he was
Right.
doing. That was mistaken. And it also helped me understand. I've talked before. He's so focused on his work that I thought maybe he's on the autism scale, that he doesn't see the rest of the world. But this statement that he made corrected me. Nibley himself stated, I cannot imagine a body of men less likely to go astray or to lead anyone else astray than the present leaders of the church. The brethren have their work cut out for them. Again, we talked earlier because he knew them personally and he saw their struggles, he saw their imperfections. He was never disillusioned that they were
Right.
flawless or anything like that. And he had empathy for what was expected of these men, just men, right? He says, the brethren have their work cut out for them, and strenuous work it is. It calls for studying the gospel and to see that the greatest possible number of people in all parts of the world get to hear the first principles. This requires constant repetition of first principles to fresh audiences wherever general authorities go. They cannot be expected to set forth advanced ideas or frontline research. So, whether a person agrees with what he said or not, what it shows me is that he understood the difference between what he was doing and what missionaries are doing.
Right.
All right. And that
Right.
the first priority of the brethren, well, and Elder McConkie wrote in the Bible dictionary under parables that same principle. He said the parable embodies the true nature of all truth. Only he who seeks finds.
I
We
think
present the we present the gospel fundamentals, and those who want more will have access to more if they're truly seeking for it. They'll know where to find it.
And if we look back at DNC, it's either 107 or 109. I always get those two confused. It lays out what the quorum of the 12 is, right? It's a
Yeah,
missionary
107. Yeah.
it's a missionary body. And so in those sorts of things, I'm willing to cut slack, right? I think, okay, well, if that's their goal, then yeah. Okay.
Well, it helped me too because like all ignorant, selfish people that we are, when we find something that's exciting and wonderful, we think everybody else has to appreciate that too. I remember in my brash younger years speaking to a bishop of a ward, the poor bishop in a ward that I was in, showing him all the stuff that Farms was sending me. And I said, we need the whole ward to be reading this stuff. And he looked at me kind of weird, like, buddy, who do you think you are? But my zeal without knowledge, that was me. And
No.
I have since learned that the less intellectual Latter-day Saints are just as important to the kingdom of God as those who love Hugh Nibley.
Right.
And it's
Right.
not one is better than another.
Absolutely.
Volume 7, Since Cumorah, 13 essays, Book of Mormon is scripture, philological notes, the philology of the text, long forgotten lore, part scientific questions, part 4, the real background of the Book of Mormon, where he talks about military history. I mean, all these doors that he's opening. Book of Mormon study, part 5, prophetic Book of Mormon. Good people and bad people. He sarcastically calls that one. Volume 8, the prophetic Book of Mormon, published in 1989. Stick of Judah, Columbus, Kangaroo Court, Camp Meetings, The Comparative Method, The Boy Nephi in Jerusalem. Wow. Literary style in the Book of Mormon. Howlers in the Book of Mormon. I was going to cover that one too. Things that the enemies of the church would laugh at are now its most convincing evidences.
Right.
Yeah. Freeman Kingman, the Lachish letters, again, those ruins. The Book of Mormon 40 years after. Okay, I'm getting lost now. Volume 9,
Ooh.
published in 1989. Approaching Zion.
Mm.
What is Zion? Zeal without knowledge, gifts, from a foundation, how to get rich. Talking about what it takes to become a Zion-like people.
Number 8 was my favorite chapter out of that whole.
Yeah, work we must, but the lunch is free. Number 9 is the essay that he gave. It would know it was the final. He had an honors class, and this was the final he gave them. But what kind of work? You have all this time and you have unlimited funds. What are you going to do? And the kids in the class, he was so disappointed, couldn't get past the money.
Right.
They were so preoccupied with it. Yeah. Breakthroughs, change out of control, law of consecration, the utopians, meaning of the atonement. So you say that in fundamentalism, approaching Zion is a
I've
very
noticed
popular book right now.
I've noticed more people in fundamentalism now picking up this book.
Why do
And
you think that is?
I think because we're all yearning for it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
If there's something within Mormonism that always seems to ignite the imagination, it's really two things. It's temple work and it's Zion, right? And I think that's by design, right? Because that's what Joseph Smith focused on, right?
Oh, of course.
Joseph didn't wasn't in the business of building church houses, right? He was just as comfortable to preach under a tree or in somebody's house or in a courtyard as he would have been in
Well,
the
there
temple.
were blueprints for the city of Zion. That was kind of
Right.
important.
Right. And so he was onto something different, right? He was onto temples and communities, right? And I think there was an understanding, or at least as I read it, my interpretation is that the temple was the first step in establishing that Zion type community, right? And so I think that you know the temple and Zion kind of go hand in hand. What I loved about approaching Zion is that probably for the first time, because we all have this idea of what it's like, right? Um,
Right,
and in my so this was the first time I had picked up a book, certainly a scholarly kind of book, at
right.
which he would take the principles and then have the audacity to say, this is what it could look like in practical application, right? And to me, that was what was so fascinating about it, is that it took this ethereal idea of what and how Zion would function and then said, okay, now this is what it could look like, right?
Yep, yep.
And so to me, this book, you know, pardon the expression, was approachable, right? It
Oh,
was
yeah,
it was not out of the realm of even somebody with a cursory understanding of this idea of Zion could get a hold
yep.
of and really begin to start tearing apart, how would this sort of society function? And what I remember when I put down the book, because I'll admit, early on in my time as a Mormon, I struggled with this concept of Zion, where there was no poor or no rich, right? Because
Right.
I definitely was on this idea that and I still believe this, that capitalism is good, right? I
Yes,
don't think it's
yes.
a net negative. I do think that outside of United Order and stuff, it is definitely the most humane system that man has come up with. Um, and so I always found myself at odds with that idea. I'm like, well, wait a second, is this idea of kind of communal living, right? And I had all these ideas about what I thought that would mean.
Right,
And,
right,
and,
right.
and I remember putting down the book after I'd read it and went, oh, so it's none of that, right? Like,
Yeah.
not socialistic in nature,
Excellent,
it's not
excellent.
communist in nature. This is something different, right?
Yes, yes.
And that's what I found. Nibley for me was the one that really kind of expanded my vision of what Zion could truly be. And it was like 5 years into me being a Mormon, right? I was still in the LDS church. Um, and it really assuaged a lot of fears that I had had on looking at Zion and what it's going to be.
I can't help but feel that he would be very happy to hear that. that his
Yeah,
work helped you understand better what Zion was and allay such fears. Yes.
yeah, and I think that Nibley is kind of enjoying a renaissance now, to be honest with you. Especially, I can't speak too much for the LDS Church because I'm just not running much in those circles anymore.
Right, right.
But certainly within fundamentalism, I'm noticing a renewed interest there, right?
Wonderful. That's
And
wonderful.
and especially this book, Approaching Zion and Temple in the Cosmos.
Well, to be honest, there isn't anyone really who has replaced him. Scripture Central is probably the online database that has taken this mantle of the collected works of Hugh Nibley and run with it. This is
Right,
where you see the guys who go through the doors that he'd opened, and now
right.
it's just free online database for anyone and everyone to look at.
Well, and I think you do bring out an interesting point, right? Because I do think that it's not an either or kind of idea, right? A lot of the stuff we find with scripture central and stuff, I thoroughly enjoy, but they're almost meant to be consumed in bite-sized pieces, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah,
Now,
yeah. That's true.
now,
More digestible. Yeah.
right? It's like, people who just want a quick short about the gospel probably won't be listening to my podcast because mine are more in depth. They're
Longer.
longer, right? Um, and so, but both of those I think are needed, right? Sometimes I look at that shorter media as something to whet your appetite, right? And then when
Well,
you're
and the
ready
cool thing about
to
that
dive
shorter
in,
media is they have live links to these
yep,
extensive articles,
yep,
some including Hugh Nibley, of course.
yep. So yeah, no, I think there's a place for both, and like I said, I get to the other side. My hope is that I can have the microphone one more time and just say, "Where's Hugh? I want to talk to Hugh Nibley for one last time."
Yeah.
It's my parting gift to the audience as I cross over the other side. So,
Right. The other thing that, Scripture Central, Book of Mormon Center, all of that stuff, as wonderful as they are, what they can't duplicate is Hugh Nibley's wit. I
yes.
mean, these zingers, they
Yep.
can't really do that. He
Nope.
did because this was his playing field. Yeah. Volume 10, The Ancient State, The Rulers and the Ruled, published in 1991. Talking about the politics of the whole ancient world. 10
This one
essays.
I've always wanted to read, and I've never had the opportunity to just sit down and read it.
This is the one that I'm least attracted to because I'm not. The Greeks and the Romans have never really intrigued me because I always felt that they were derivative of older,
Right.
uh, uh, more original civilizations. Volume 11, Tinkling Cymbals and Sounding Brass. This is the largest of them, and I only list here five big sections, but know that the subsections of all of that wouldn't fit on a single slide.
I
But no
always
man,
felt
yeah.
I always felt with this particular work, you may not be an expert apologist when you're done, but you're going to be pretty well armed,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah,
if you go through this book, and quite frankly, you don't even need to sit down and read it cover to cover, right? And because of its name, right? And I understand why he named it what he did, and I
yeah.
wouldn't change it myself, but it leaves people perplexed on what it could be. But I've often said if you got to quit, if you're trying to defend the gospel and you don't know how, this book here, you can just go look up a topic, kind of, right?
At the very least, he familiarizes you with the common weapons
Right,
of the anti-Mormon. Yeah,
right,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Almost 700 pages. Volume 12.
Ah, man.
Woo! Temple and Cosmos, 1992. 20 essays, chapters. Meaning of the temple, return to the temple, sacred vestments. Don't have time for that. Circle on the square. Don't have time for that. Expanding gospel, apocryphal writings, terrible questions, one eternal round. Genesis, the written word, best possible test. From the earth upon which thou standest, so on and so forth.
So I got to tell you, I read this book probably 2 years after I was first endowed in the LDS church.
Yeah.
And I remember I went over to an older gentleman's house really knowledgeable guy. And I'm like, dude, I know we're not supposed to talk about stuff that happens in the temple on the outside, but do you have something? And I remember he just kind of gave me the side eye, right? He's like kind of debating on if he wants to do it or not. And he's like, all right, come with me. And he loaned me this book. And I remember the first time you start seeing the parallels between in the quote, the Egyptian endowment and the endowment as we now have it going, oh, oh wow, this was the first time that I went from Joseph Smith was inspired to, oh no, Joseph Smith knew some stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
he wasn't just inspired, he knew some stuff. To put this back into this context, and quite frankly, opened up another world of thought and ideas that I'm not going to share here yet, but that absolutely um blew my mind, right? And the story is far more contiguous than what we would like to imagine.
Yeah, for me, it's the difference between going to the temple and saying, this is nice. This feels nice. I don't
Right.
know. It seems a little different. The difference between that and going to the temple with full confidence, what I'm doing is ancient
Yep.
and originated with God.
Absolutely.
And the part that always gets it, I remind me of, I have documents in my house that details Jesus Christ, first person, showing his disciples how to do this.
Yep.
When you realize that, then you just really dig in and take what you're doing far more seriously because
You
you
know,
realize what it is and what a miracle it is that we get to participate in
I've
those
always
same rights.
I remember when I finished this book and my wife, because look, I am the simplest individual you will ever meet, right? Um, I get the same thing for my birthday every single year, and I'm cool with it, right? Um, which is I usually get a new book about the gospel, right?
Yep.
Either a really old one or a new one that I find fascinating,
Yep.
right? And I'll drop hints to well now my wives, but at that time it was just Amber, right? I'd be like, I'm not saying you should, but I think you should try, and I would just slide a title in front of her, right? When
Yep.
it hit around
Yep.
my birthday. And the other was the new Madden football game, right? You want to talk about the ultimate dichotomy. That was it, right? Um, and Sunday Ticket. That was it, right? But I remember I had kind of after I'd read it all the way through cover to cover, and she got it for me again the next year, and I reread it. She's like, so what's your takeaway from that book? And I said this tongue in cheek. Now I tend to think about it a little more seriously, actually. I was like, this book needs to be handed to you when you exit the temple for your first time,
Yeah.
right? As you're
Yeah.
walking out, someone says, hey, thanks for serving in the temple today. Thanks for taking out your endowments. Now go home and read this and keep
Now
coming
you will
back
understand
as
this.
you're reading
Yes.
it because
Yes.
I
Yes. Yes.
feel like that if we did that, it would put temple work in such a different light, right? Um, and it would add such rich meaning, and quite frankly, it would diffuse a lot of the questions that surround the endowment, right? We do
Oh,
know.
the misinformation surrounding the origin of the endowment.
Right, because a
Wow.
lot of
Yeah.
people just say, "Oh, well, Joseph just ripped it off for the Masons." Well, that's not it at all, right?
Not
There's
even close.
there are Masonic. Now, let me rephrase this. The Masonic ritual has elements of the ancient endowment
Correct.
that now there are in the modern day endowment, and I say modern day, and I'm talking post restoration. In that temple ordinances, you can find things that Masons share in that, right?
Correct. I estimate between 2 and 5%.
Yep. You and I talked about that. But they focus on that 2 to 5% to cast a cloud of dispersion
Sure, of
on the
course.
temple. You read
Yeah,
this book, you will walk away and go, no, 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 no. The Masons had some right, but
yeah,
this is far more ancient than the Scottish or York rite.
that's exactly right. I will tell friends. Let me grabbing my copy here, but oh god, uh, of my publication that takes Temple and Cosmos and multiplies it relative to teachings of the temple.
Yep,
Because he talks about circle and square, he talks about the clothing, meaning. Uh, my book is able to gather together sources that he didn't have available to him at that time yet. And so I'll tell friends, I'll say, if they have a copy of my book, I'll say, after you go to the temple, I want you to read from page 281 to page 336
yep,
of my book. And what you will find in that book is every single thing that you did in that St. George Temple anciently.
yep, yep,
Every single thing. So Freemasonry, 2 to 5%, ancient texts dealing with temple rites that are unrecognizable to the rest of the world, 100%,
right.
including the proper context.
The other thing that this book did for me, um, and I'm a guy who loves to go out and explore new things, right? And
Yeah,
there was a time where I was really into to earth earth and formations, right? Done by the
yeah,
earth,
yeah.
right? And Nibley in this book, and I can't remember where exactly, he talks about the squared circle, right? And all of a sudden, when you start understanding that and you look at ancient rock formations, right, that were
Yeah.
done by ancient man,
Yeah.
or certain mound formations, you start going, oh, now wait a second, this is interesting, right? This book will blow people's minds in a good way. You will be stretched, and you will never look at the temple the same way again.
Yeah. Yeah. Such a beautiful thing. And it's the difference between a person looking at the temple and going, well, that was a weird thing Joseph Smith cooked up, and looking at the temple and going, God instituted this from the time of Adam.
Yep,
And the evidence
overwhelming.
is spread throughout history that this was had in previous dispensations. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Volume 13. Brother Brigham challenges the saints. He was when he was working for Widsoe before he went to Brigham Young. They were editing some Brigham Young project. I can't remember which publication it was. And this really was the opportunity for Hugh Nibley to take a deep dive into teachings of Brigham Young, and that's where he fell in love with Brigham Young's teachings. So here we have 19 essays from Brother Brigham. And tonight we'll go over number 13, Educating the Saints, but all Brigham Young. And that was published in 94. Volume 14 was published in 2000, Abraham in Egypt. 13 chapters, 13 essays, speaking all the aspects regarding Abraham,
Hmm.
particularly how it relates to our book of Abraham, where it came from, how it relates to the other Abrahamic traditions in history. My favorite chapter has to be, I think, chapter 11, The Trouble with Ham. This is where you see Hugh Nibley at his most progressive in terms of being non racist. He was way ahead of that game. One of the things he said that I'm trying to remember was like, I wish there was time to have covered that chapter. Given the fact that, and of course, because of his time period in the 60s, our black brothers and sisters were referred to as Negroes. And he would say, because of the circumstances of their birth, you will see far more Negroes in the celestial kingdom than you will see stake presidents.
Whew.
And he talks about him, and he talks about the marriage of Joseph and Asenath and what that represents in terms of the unification of the races. Because in his view, from his perspective and his study of Egyptian history, Asenath, Joseph's wife, was black. And
Right.
so that all the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh had the blood of Ham in them, which
Right.
was, and Nibley says God is trying to teach us. He doesn't want us to divide ourselves. He wants us to be united. He wants us to be one people.
Right.
Anyway, and that has loads of implications. So, volume 15, Apostles and Bishops in Early Christianity. So now he's talking about historical Christianity in the first few centuries.
Hmm.
2005. Also in 2005, probably the most complex publication because of all of the pictures, and it is the largest of it doesn't follow the same format because of all the pictures in there depicting the Egyptian reliefs.
But for a guy like me who would have tried to do a college thesis on green eggs and ham, I mean, the amount of pictures in that book make it just absolutely entertaining. So,
Well, this is a deep dive into the Joseph Smith Papyri and how it relates to ancient Egypt, and it's really like the commentary, the nature and the purpose of the Book of Breathings. He has a lot of thoughts about the Joseph Smith Papyri, which is the name for those fragments, and I can't emphasize the word fragments enough. The classic mistake that anti-Mormons try to get Mormons to misunderstand is that what was gifted to the church in 1967 was all of the papyri that the church bought while they were in Kirtland. And that is utterly and completely false.
right.
What was gifted to the church in 1967 represents at most 10% of the scrolls that he had in his possession and was working with.
Absolutely. And we
And
lost
so
a large portion of them in the Chicago fire.
the vast majority, and historical witnesses say that Joseph Smith was working from the longer scroll,
Right.
which some say at most was almost 40 feet long.
True.
That is not, these little fragments that we have came from when after Joseph Smith's death. The collection was divided into two. The ragged edges were cut off and mounted in frames on the wall by Joseph's mother. The larger part of the collection was sold to the Chicago Museum, which burned in the Great
Right.
Chicago Fire. So, and so what we in the Joseph Smith Papyri, what we have is what is commonly known as the Book of Breathings, which is a common funerary text. But nevertheless, he takes what we have, and it's one of the few remaining examples of that, and it's a fairly good example of the Book of Breathings and how that relates to the teachings of the restored gospel. So, in the endowment. Volume 17, Eyewitness Eloquent, Hugh Nibley on Himself and Others and the Temple. This is where we get the video, The Faith of an Observer, where he talks about his life after life experience, his life after death experience, where we get the written text of that video, among other things. 33 essays. I'm running out of brain juice. This is too much. Volume 18, Approach to the Book of Abraham, published in 2009, where he goes into depth of the first facsimile. And he talks about the meaning of the Kirtland Egyptian papers that were
Right.
found relative to all of that. And finally, Volume 19, published 2010, after his death, One Eternal Round. It was supposed to be his magnus opus. He thought that he could finish this before he died, where he take everything he's ever learned and taught and to try and circumscribe it into one great central message. And you didn't quite make it. So a
You didn't
student,
want to say one great message. I know where you were going.
What? I don't know what you're talking about.
I know.
One great whole, one eternal round. In any case, Michael Rhodes, Egyptologist, Michael Rhodes has done everything, retired military, was
Yeah,
tasked with taking all of Hugh Nibley's notes, which were considerable, and making a book out of it. And that's what we have here. Ah, and here we have critics, myth, Abraham the Great Year Right, Hypocephalus, Ascension dramas, Joseph Smith Hermetic tradition, Hypocephala, the Kabbalah, Alexander the Great, Nimrod, and geometry. Wow,
Phew.
that's a lot. And so when we say that the breadth of his knowledge and research is almost indescribable, this is why. And
Yeah,
this is why we've gone down this path of 19 volumes, trying to give you some sense of what is in each.
absolutely.
Now, dessert, Ken's favorites. Three. So in volume 13, Brother Brigham challenges the saints. So there's an essay entitled Educating the Saints, published in 1994. So quoting Brigham Young, Hugh Nibley writes, "What are we here for? To learn to enjoy more and to increase in knowledge and in experience." Nibley says, "Learning is our proper calling," quoting Brigham again. "We shall never cease to learn unless we apostatize." Can you
Hmm.
understand that? I
Yep.
mean, he's just carrying on what Joseph Smith taught. God has given us mental and physical powers to be improved. And along with them, our senses, if properly educated, are channels of endless felicity to us.
Mm.
So Brigham was, oh my goodness, from what little he had access to, the expansive thinking that he was capable of is astonishing to me still.
Absolutely.
Um, all systems are go for the expanding mind. Brigham, let us not narrow ourselves up, for the world, with all its variety of useful information and its rich hoard of hidden treasure, is before us. And eternity, with all its sparkling intelligence, lofty aspirations, and unspeakable glories, is before us. Nibley, the news is all good. Is all good. Oh, what did I? Forever. Uh, Brigham. And when we have passed into the sphere where Joseph is, there is still another department, and then another, and so on, to an eternal progression in exaltation and eternal lives. That is the exaltation I am looking for. When we
Mhm.
have lived millions of years in the presence of God and angels, shall we then cease learning? No, or eternity ceases. Nibley, first and last, the gospel is learning unlimited.
Mm. Phew. So there's, oh, you got more. Never mind. I'll wait till you're done.
It's gonna be a while. Speak up.
So that first part there is so much there to unpack, right? And one of those that immediately jumped out to me was this idea that we have spiritual and physical gifts that we're to continue to learn upon. Is that how that was phrased? Go back one slide. Um, God has given us mental and physical powers to be improved. Okay, this is one of the things that I love about Joseph Smith and the Restoration. For so long, humanity has been beaten down because of our humanity, our mortality, right? And
Yep,
and we certainly see that even in something that we read earlier, where the natural man is an enemy to God, right?
yep, yep.
For the first time in my estimation, within Christianity, there was this idea that your humanity does not have to be an impediment on your way to meeting deity,
That's
right?
right.
That it's
The body is not inherently evil.
right,
Yes,
and that even those appetites aren't evil. They're evil when they're left unchecked,
that's
right?
right. That's right.
And and this idea of the corporeal, the tangible, the material, that can be holy as well, and indeed that's its ultimate destiny, right? And it's not so much a different kind of happiness, but the same kind of unhappiness you enjoy here, only magnified. Those
Yes.
revolutionary teachings within Mormonism and revolutionary revolutionary teachings within religion, period.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And that's what I think sometimes we miss out on, right? Is this idea that no, your humanity is not an impediment to the divine. You need your humanity to meet God. And that will be your ultimate state if you reach exaltation, because those passions will still be there,
Mhm.
but they will have to be bridled and used in their proper order.
Yep. Yep. This is typical Brigham. Shall I sit down and read the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Covenants all the time? Says one, yes, if you please, and when you have done, you may be nothing but a sectarian after all. It is your duty to study everything upon the face of the earth, in addition to reading those books. Basically, what Joseph Smith says, but in a very direct manner that is easily
Yep.
understood. Another
Yep.
one of my favorites. If any of you feel that there is no life in your meetings, then it becomes your duty to go and instill life into that meeting and do your part to produce an increase of the spirit and power of God in the meetings in your locality. It's like I remember thinking we attend our meetings for at least two reasons: to be fed and also to help feed, to contribute. And we
Well,
often forget that,
we would
Oh, the lesson wasn't very good today. Well, did you ask any questions? You
right,
know?
right. No, that's exactly right. And in this way, I've often said the gospel is kind of capitalistic, right? In a sense, we are saved, right? And this is where I think we lose a lot of our evangelical brothers and sisters, right? Because we use the term saved, but we mean it in a different connotation, right? We believe
Yeah.
in the salvation that Jesus offers, right? That is a free gift, right? However, Mormonism teaches something more expansive. Once that's in place, now there's exaltation, right?
Yep. Yep.
And
Which
and
in
so
which in truth is taught in the Bible. They just
it's
conveniently leave that out. John
right,
chapter 5.
exactly, exactly. And so in this, right, is this idea that there's more to be had, but you have to put in the work, right? And
Yep.
this is where, certainly salvation is a free gift, but exaltation is something you will get out of it what you put into it. It's kind of capitalistic in that way, right?
Well, call it what you want. The Bible calls it the law of the harvest.
Yep,
You reap what you sow.
absolutely.
How much more simple could that be?
And but that filters down, right? Just as you were as Brigham says here, um so often I hear people say, "Well, why would I go to church?" Right? I mean, we're just going to sit down, we're going to talk some more. And my question is often, well, who's missing out on you not being there? What insights can you bring to the table that the rest of us need?
Yeah. And it's not just kind of it's a selfish view of looking at it.
Yep.
Don't you feel any responsibility to
Yep.
others? Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, Brigham Young again. That diffidence or timidity we must dispense with. When it becomes our duty to talk, we ought to be willing to talk, interchanging our ideas and exhibiting that which we believe and understand affords us an opportunity for detecting and correcting errors. Nibley, the expanding mind must be openly and frankly critical, come hell or high council. Without that, we get, uh, quoting Brigham, too much of a sameness in this community. Brigham goes on, I am not a stereotyped Latter day Saint, and I do not believe in the doctrine. Are we going to stand still? Away with stereotyped Mormons.
Wow.
I loved that. That's always stuck with me. I mean,
Yeah,
the fact that we all want try to be Peter Priesthood is a false doctrine.
it absolutely is. And It's such a fine line, right? I mean, because if there's one thing that I'm certainly critical of in Mormonism in total is this idea of us all looking the same, all talking the same, sounding,
Oh, boo. Yeah.
right? And it's refreshing to know that that was not what Joseph or Brigham seemed to have in mind here, right? I think,
Nor Paul in the New Testament, nor anybody. That,
right. Yep, yep. You don't have to abandon who you are at your core, right? Um, you may have to give up certain traditions of your fathers, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But having said that, I don't think anybody would in those days be against you keeping your traditions, right? If those are good traditions, right? Or keeping your ethnicity alive in you. I don't
Paul
think,
taught the kingdom of God requires our differences.
yep,
That without our differences, the kingdom wouldn't function.
absolutely. Absolutely. Good stuff.
The law of individual differences, it has been called. Brigham, in things pertaining to this life, the lack of knowledge manifested by us as a people is disgraceful. He goes on, I have seen months and months in this city when I could have wept like a whipped child to see the awful stupidity of the people. I feel like taking men and women by the hair of their heads, figuratively speaking, and slinging them miles and miles, and like crying, stop before you ruin yourselves.
Can I
That's
just
classic.
say, I just love some Brigham, right? Like every once in a while.
Yeah, that wouldn't fly today, would it? But I'll tell you
Oh,
what. I mean, that was the rhetorical style.
yep.
And in some sects of Mormonism today, that tradition is beloved and continues.
Right.
I heard a talk at a funeral recently of a fundamentalist that as little girls, she and her sister would pretend church. They'd take all of their little dolls and stuffed animals, sit them on the couch, and yell at them.
Yep. Yep.
Wow. Now, at the end of quoting Brigham and all his feelings about learning and education, Hugh Nibley makes the application to us today. He says, as a result, whenever we move out of our tiny, busy orbits of administration and display, we find ourselves in a terrifying intellectual vacuum. Terrifying, of course, only because we might be found out. But that is just the trouble. Having defaulted drastically in terms of President Young's instructions, we now stand as a brainless giant, a pushover for any smart kid or cultist or faddist or crank who even pretends to have read a few books. That puts them beyond our depth. And so we, I include myself, he says humbly, stand helplessly and foolishly by, dangling our bonnet and plume while hundreds of students and missionaries of members and enemies of the church alike presume to challenge and reject the teachings of Joseph Smith on evidence so flimsy that no half educated person would give it a second thought. An
Mm,
awesome outpouring of newly discovered documents of direct bearing on the history and teachings of the church is even now in full spate, amazing and confounding Jewish and Christian scholars, but bursting with good news for the Latter day Saints who ignore them completely.
mm. Wow. That's a serious critique.
And I don't disagree.
No.
And I don't disagree even today. However, line upon line, precept upon precept,
Right.
there's no other way around it. And maybe I'm callous. I don't believe the majority of people on earth ever will be to the point where They're hungering and thirsting after righteousness and knowledge.
Well, and do you think that I can't help but think that wasn't maybe both Brigham and um Hugh Nibley's point here, right? Is that you're hungering after the wrong things,
For sure.
right?
For sure.
And especially like that first uh slide we had, you get a sense that Brigham is almost pleading with the saints of his time, raise your eyes a little higher, right? Reach a little farther, right? There are certain times where, if I'm reading in the Journal of Discourses, especially the early ones, you get a sense almost from time to time that Brigham's like, okay, yeah, let's get our needs met, but we got bigger things we got to do, right? Let's get the crops in, let's get a civilization kick started here, but we're on to bigger things, right?
Well,
He
and you
talks
see
about
that with Joseph. You see that with
yep,
Joseph too.
yep. He starts talking about the arts, about the theater, about the operas, right? There is this idea of the Latter-day Saints being a more well-rounded, dare I say, cultured people. And
Yes,
and Brigham, that's what Brigham's looking at, right? I think that's what Joseph had in mind. And I think we do have to recapture a certain part of that spirit.
I agree. I agree. Our second essay, chapter 7, Treasures in the Heavens from volume 1. Here he draws extensively from apocryphal, pseudepigraphical, extra-canonical texts to teach us a little bit about what treasures in the heavens mean. To make the treasure test a fair one, two treasures are placed before us on equal footing, the doctrine of the two ways. Their two natures being mingled in exactly equal portions in every human being. To neutralize what otherwise would be the overpowering appeal of the heavenly treasure, the memory of its former glories has been erased from the mind of man, which is thus in a state of equilibrium, enjoying by the ancient law of liberty complete freedom to choose whatever it will. In this state, whatever choice is made represents the true heart and mind of the one who makes it.
Mm,
Plan of salvation, but couched in different terms, helping us to understand more clearly the choice
right.
that lies before us. And
Absolutely.
what you can't see here, every time you see quotation marks, he's quoting from an ancient text,
Mm,
which the wording is just different enough from our what we colloquially refer to in the plan of salvation that it makes us consider it in a slightly different light. It's one thing I love about these ancient texts.
okay, so this is fascinating. Okay, so where he has in quotations there, the ancient law of liberty, he's
Yeah,
quoting from an ancient text.
yeah.
So
And I don't have
another
time and
ancient,
space. I don't have time and space on the slides to show you where that's coming from, but it
right.
is, yeah.
But my point is the ancient text is referring to something ancient to them,
Well, which we refer to as agency,
right?
the ancient law of liberty.
It's
Uh,
just it kind of stretches the mind to think about it going back that far.
yeah, you just wait. The
Okay.
next one. As teacher and administrator of the ordinances, the priest holds the key to the spiritual treasure house,
Mm,
in which, quote, the merit accruing from ceremonial worship is accumulated. These ordinances, imported directly from that treasury of light, to which they alone offer the means of return, are types of what is done above. Through them, quote, souls are led to the treasury of light.
wow.
Between us and the great king of the treasury of light are many steps and veils, unquote.
Wow.
And it is only by, quote, giving the proper replies to the guardians, unquote, that one is able to approach and finally enter the treasury of light. The ordinances are most secret. They are usually called mysteries. and it is through their scrupulous observance that every man, quote, puts his own treasure in order.
Wow. So I'm going to be gentle here. I'm going to be careful. But there are so many points in that last statement, so many things that are said that are eerily similar to some of the opening remarks right before an endowment session begins.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can quote Brigham when he says that.
Right?
Yeah,
Yep.
sure. Yeah. Where did Brigham Young get that? He didn't have these ancient documents.
No, he got it from Joseph Smith.
Oh my. Yeah, where did Joseph Smith get that? He didn't have these ancient documents.
Ken, we've been over this. He got it from the collective consciousness.
What strikes me, that verbiage that they use is identical
Yep.
to verbiage that's been translated from Coptic into English.
Yep.
The specificity of Revelation continues to astonish me.
Right.
Yeah. Next quote. This preoccupation with locus or place assumes a plurality of worlds. And indeed, in our treasure texts, we often find worlds, earths, and cosmoses in the plural. It is only the fallen angels, in fact, led by the blind Samael, Satan, who insist, quote, we are alone and there is none beside us, unquote. To the sons of light, on the other hand, there is opened up the grandiose vision of the worlds, united in the common knowledge of him who made them, exchanging joyful and affectionate messages as they, quote, keep faith with one another, unquote,
Hmm.
in the common plan and, quote, talk to each other and establish concord, each contributing something of its own, unquote, to the common interest. The members of the vast complex are kept in perfect accord by the sustaining word of God, which reaches all alike, since it possesses, quote, through the power of the treasure, unquote, the capacity for traveling for unlimited distances with inexpressible speed. This word is also the Son,
Hmm.
who, quote, has betaken himself to the numberless hidden worlds which have come to know him, unquote. The messages may also be borne by special messengers and inspectors, angels with special assignments and marvelous powers of getting around, who constantly go forth on their missions and return with their reports. Whoa.
Wow. Holy cow. Woo. More
In my
temple
book,
stuff.
you'll find the discussion of this mode of transportation under light, pillar of, etc., etc. It's
Man.
quite lengthy, and I've quoted it here to you before, where the Dead Sea Scrolls talks about the Grand Central Station
Right. Yep.
of these messengers, and it is
Yep.
it far surpasses any science fiction you could ever, forget Stargate, right?
Right.
This stuff's amazing. Again, from Treasures in the Heavens. We on earth are not aware of all this because we comprehend only what we are like. Not only is God rendered invisible by the impenetrable veil of light that surrounds him, but he has purposely, quote, placed veils between the worlds, unquote, that all treasures may be hid from those who do not seek them in the proper way. Why do we need veils and guards between the worlds and the kingdoms? To protect the uninitiated from the glory so they don't kill
Right.
themselves accidentally. Um, on the other side of the veil of the temple lay the secrets of heaven, the celestial spaces that know no bounds, and all that they contain. The Welon, the veil, quarantines this polluted world mercifully from the rest. Stick that in your pipe and smoke it.
Ooh.
Beyond the veil are the heavens, and that goes for other worlds as well as this one, for each is shut off by its veil, for there are eons and veils and firmaments, quote, he made a veil for their worlds, surrounding them like a wall, unquote. Behind the ultimate veil sits Yehu, quote, the father of the treasury of light, unquote, who is separated from all others by the veil. I'm not even going to try and pronounce kata pitzmata, a veil being that which separates that which is above from that which is below. When a cycle has been completed in the existence of all things, Joseph Smith would have called that an eternity.
Yep.
The great Sabaoth and the God looks Sabaoth the good looks out from behind the veil, and all that has gone before is dissolved and passes into oblivion. Only the qualified can pass by one of these veils, of course. When
Wow.
Pistis Sophia, hooray, presumed to look behind the veil before she was ready, she promptly fell from her former glory. Only Jesus has passed through all the veils at all the degrees of glory and authority. As one grows in faith, more and more is revealed until finally the watchers move the veils aside and you enter into the presence of the Father who gives you his name and his seal.
Wow. Whew.
Now, some shorter ones from the treasures in the heavens. With a new creation, things become visible on a new level. This is consistent with the doctrine that one sees or comprehends only what one is like,
Wow.
which is why the terrestrial cannot even comprehend the celestial. It is beyond their
They're
understanding, their
they're
intelligence.
yep.
In reclaiming its treasure, the spirit becomes what it was before removing its garment. The dwellers upon earth can understand only what is upon the earth, and the same applies to other worlds. Beings comprehend only what they are like, so that the Lord must take the form of those to whom he appears.
Hmm. That's
Epistle Sophia talks about he can turn his glory up and down relative to the specific
right.
needs. If he appeared in his full glory, he'd toast us all.
Right.
I like this one. God isolates hostile worlds from each other, lest they unite against him.
Whew. There's some deep stuff. Holy cow.
All right, are you ready for the big finish?
I am.
Unrolling the scrolls, some forgotten witnesses
Okay.
from volume 1. One of the very recently discovered documents says God the Father of all our eternal bodies brings about the resurrection of the flesh through members of the Godhead. Do not be afraid of the world of the. Oh, okay. So I forgot to say where the quotes were. He's quoting a document. I mean, we're like, yeah, it's LDS doctrine. No, this is from an ancient document. One of the very recently discovered documents says, quote, God the Father of all our eternal bodies brings about the resurrection of the flesh through members of the Godhead. Do not be afraid of the world of the physis or the physical world. The living spirit clothes itself with the body of elements through which it is enabled to carry out its works in the worlds. The Pissa Sophia, a very important early work, says, quote, there is a place afforded for everything, a topos. Some Coptics use the Greek words every once in a while because they don't have any that express exactly the idea of topos. A topos is a place for a certain thing to be performed. He explains more. There is a numbering of souls for each world, and a dispensation is not completed until that number has been fulfilled. Every soul stays in its appointed topos until it has fulfilled the mission and task appointed for it in that place.
Whew.
Mine house is a house of order, he says. He goes, time and matter and space are all organized. It's well understood that all this setting of times is for our nature and for the purpose of our testing in this world, otherwise known as a temporal existence. And he says it's only a temporary arrangement. It is a characteristic of this particular world. For God, there is no time. At least he doesn't use our time at all. The documents make this very, very clear. They now admit that matter is there and that it's organized, but it's not enough to arrange matter with order and system. Such matter remains for all its pretty patterns inert, background stuff. Without life, matter is inert and helpless, those early writers say. It must be improved by the action of light. The creators have a special force, which the early writers call light. Not light exactly as we understand it. Structure is not enough. Whenever the active principle is withdrawn, matter at once falls back into its original lifeless, inert condition. It is the same with all matter. It must be touched by some activating force, according to the ancients. And he starts to put this together. He doesn't say it here, but it's a difference between it's the definition of what is organized matter versus matter unorganized.
Right.
The records call it the spark, the Spinter, a word that occurs numerous times. The spark is mentioned throughout, and it is what makes the difference. The spark is that which comes from one world to another. The spark is also that which animates at a distance. This vitalizing principle is everywhere referred to as the spark, without which, says the so-called second Coptic work, there is no awareness. We would say intelligence.
Okay. So real quick, in the last three sections we just read,
Uh,
and I point this out to show what Nibley is onto here and what he's thinking. He talks about matter, right? And that matter is
yes.
nothing more than structure until there's that spark, that life.
Yep. It's inert without the spark.
Yes, it's inert. It doesn't matter. And he talks about that light, not as, and he says, not as we understand it, but that is the organizing principle of it, right? It's not enough
Very
to
good.
structure, but that light has to be the organizing factor of it. And then he seems to almost go into what we would term human consciousness. There is no awareness, right?
Yes. Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it's all these metaphysical ideas placed within the material that
Excellent.
that connects right back to what I was saying before with Joseph Smith's mission. The corporeal or the temporal is not in and of itself unholy by nature.
Very good. Very good. Which is in contrast to what the Greeks believed that
Yes,
the physical was inherently evil, and we were trying to uh, rid ourselves of the physical, which
right.
is not surprisingly a perversion of the true gospel.
Yep.
Um, or as Eric Skousen put it in his book, Earth in the Beginning, what the gods are doing, they're taking unorganized matter and fusing it with unorganized intelligence, thereby
Right.
bringing to pass the plan of salvation. He goes on, when this vitalizing principle touches matter, according to the Psalm of Thomas, one of the new Syriac manuscripts, consciousness is expanded. The worlds of darkness gathered and beheld his brightness. Quote, the worlds of darkness gathered and beheld his brightness. They breathed his fragrance. They orbited about him and bowed and knew him and worshiped him. Unquote.
Mm.
The matter itself is just part of the story. It can be imbued with the spirit, but it will always change. It is always undergoing processing and changing. Only progeny is eternal. Only sons go on forever, says the Gospel of Philip. That was the plan of heaven. Part of Satan's plan was to have a static world that would not change. It would not only be perfect, it would be static in its physical structure as well. But the plan agreed on was that worlds would constantly come into existence and pass away, and that the process would never cease. Matter would always be processed again and again, and this would go on, whereas this same writing says that only sons are eternal. Sonship, progeny, goes on forever, so that while the other elements become serviceable to the needs of the spirit, as the Gospel of Philip puts it, there is no permanence in matter. It always undergoes change as worlds come into existence and pass away. Only progeny is eternal.
Holy cow.
Here's what the Pista Sophia says about it. It has to be matter decontaminated, melted down, then purified. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah.
There's a lot about decontamination. The action of the light on matter always has a purifying effect, whether for the first time or whether it's being reused. Indeed, there's no such thing as used or old matter, since by the action of the spark or of the light upon it, the matter always becomes renewed. Let matter rejoice in the light, for the light will leave no matter unpurified.
Hmm.
Or what section 130 calls urim and thummim, purified matter, uh, a globe of a sea of glass and fire.
And
After the,
oh,
huh?
sorry. There's something else there too that I think can be very very applicable to our quest for sanctification, right? Letting the light touch us, so to speak, here in this world
Mm-hmm.
to become sanctified.
Excellent. After the plan of creation was accepted, it was communicated to all the other worlds. All the other worlds contributed something to the making of this one because they rejoiced in such a project. For the worlds exist, we are told in the Askew manuscript, which is another uh, title for the Pista Sophia, so that intelligent spirits might come and inhabit them. Not only are the worlds countless, according to Philip, but they have been going on forever. Adam's holy angels inhabit many worlds.
Ooh, ooh.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm I'm not going to point this out, although I really want to. Adam's holy angels inhabit many worlds. That's a loaded term, Ken.
It sure is.
That's a loaded term. I'm just saying it's worth pointing out there that there could be a certain doctrine
It
or
could,
theory depending on who you are.
it could be interpreted that way, couldn't
It
it?
could. I'm just saying it's possible. I'm not saying you do. I'm saying I do, but not you.
Well, I mean, to be honest, there's more than one interpretation that could come
Right.
from that.
Yep. Yep.
But
No.
someday you and I will go down that merry path together.
We will. We will. It'll be a good time. It'll be a good time. One of us will say to the other, I owe you lunch. So,
Our older Christian sources also remind us that in the great scheme of things, everything is in the plural. Worlds, universes, plans, gods, spaces, saviors, and so forth. Mind you, this is published way
oh,
before Hubble Deep Field,
holy
right?
cow.
That's why I think it was in 1994 when the Hubble Deep Field
Yep.
first showed us how many universes possibly there really were. I teared up because I
I
believed it
know.
all along, and now you can see it. A multiplicity of worlds are organized on a common pattern. For example, a newly found Apocryphon of James, also the ASCII manuscript, Pris Sophia, and the second Coptic work, and the Apocryphon of John, among others, notes that in all the worlds there is a common pattern, and its base is a monad rule. There is one rule everywhere, but God always rules through a presidency of three and through a council of 12, no matter what the world is.
Hmm.
This is a law that exists throughout all the worlds. Mine house is a house of order.
Right.
A number of these sources talk about that. These repetitions are infinite in number and scope. Carl Schmidt, a great theologian, non LDS,
Mhm.
believed that second Yeu How do I talk about? There are two texts called First and Second Yehu, the books of Yehu, that the Pistis Sophia refers to specifically.
Hmm.
Pistis Sophia talks, gives the outline of these ordinances and then says, you want to know about these, if you want to know more about these ordinances, refer to the books of Yehu. And the books of Yehu are basically the script for the endowment.
Really?
Yeah.
I remember
When you get
we
when you
talked
get to
about
this,
that, I think, actually, when we
yeah,
were talking about the Pistis Sophia.
we talked about a lot, haven't we? But there's more. So Carl Schmidt believed that Second Yehu was the most important of all early Christian writings.
Wow.
The books of Yehu, they read like, and they're kind of repetitious. When you get to this veil, make this sign and say this word, is what it's saying.
Oh,
It uses the word cipher instead of sign.
well,
Anyway,
Joseph Smith was a pretty good guesser, wasn't he?
wow, he sure was.
Yeah. Yeah. Really tapped into that collective consciousness. I'll tell you what.
I I'm such an idiot. My mind is just so slow. Here I've compiled this book of thousands, numbering in the thousands of unmistakable parallels with restored doctrine. And my brain still, being in this world is slow to recognize its complete and absolute truth.
Absolutely.
Or to be aware of it at least. I mean, I understand it um, intellectually, but to fully accept it and to fully experience it and celebrate it, it's still stupid. Okay, let's go on. Let's see, and it goes on. And this tells us that a person who is sent to take charge of a new world, as Adam was sent to take charge of this world, is called Yehu, a form of the word Jehovah. Then he says, quote, as Yehus become fathers, once you have become established, you become a father, then you will appoint Yehus for new worlds, who will in time become fathers, and so on ad infinitum. Unquote. So
Ooh,
you have the Yehus promoted to fathers, who then send out other sons as Yehus, and so forth. Each eon, an eon is like a
right.
kingdom, has created for its own host 10,000 times 10,000.
Holy cow. So what Nibley brings forth here is absolute proof of this idea of eternal progression.
Yeah.
Taking steps one at a time on up to the ultimate promises of exaltation, godhood.
Yes. Yes. And the funny thing is, it's not Nibley saying it. It's Nibley quoting 2,000-year-old documents that are saying it.
Wow.
10,000 times 10,000 is a billion.
Yeah.
Each eon has created for its own host billions.
I think at the beginning of this, I need to tell everybody they need to have duct tape handy because you're going to have to piece your head back together after it explodes.
Yeah.
Whew.
Or wear a very tight hat.
Yes.
So there is only, quoting Nibley again, so there is only one God, only one ruling mind, and only one pattern after all. The oneness of God is never jeopardized here. The Askew manuscript, I don't know why it just doesn't call it Pis Sophia, says, quote, there are many mansions, many regions, degrees, worlds, spaces, and heavens, but all have but one law. If you keep that law, you too can become creators of worlds. Unquote. An
Wow.
astonishing statement.
And see, in this one, he tackles. Well, he doesn't tackle. He brings forth these ancient manuscripts, or he elaborates on them. This idea of the oneness of God, of the gods, right? What does that
Yeah.
mean? What does that? And the answer is here. Hmm.
One Lord, one truth, one faith, one baptism. If you are not one, you are not mine.
Right.
The holy priesthood after the order of the Son of God. Not there are other orders, but if you want to be part of God's kingdom, yeah. He goes on, all the quote, all the other worlds look to the same God as to a common son, unquote. The crucifixion is effective in worlds other than this one. Another says, quote, all the cosmoses follow the pattern of a single world, which is called the type, the archetype.
Mm,
Ever since the beginning, this has been so, keeping the entire physis in the state of joy and rejoicing, unquote. He says, because it has been organized, it's the same.
right.
Quote, the worlds exchange wisdom with each other because they are equally dependent on the Most High, unquote. They have the same common source. Quote, they are the heralds of his thought, unquote, says the famous 12th Ode of Solomon. Quote, by his word they communicate with each other. They know him who made them because they are in concord. They have a common ruler, a common Lord, so they are in concord with each other, and they communicate with him and through him, with each other, for the mouth of the Most High has spoken to them. Unquote. Another ode, quote, the worlds were made by his word and by the thought of his heart, so they are all as one. I love this part. There is no rivalry or competition among them, but they are glorious in their firmaments and agree among themselves. It's supposed to say fitting together like the lashes of an eye. All rejoice in each other, each being more glorious and bright than the other, unquote.
Wow.
So you understand how these gazillions of worlds fit together.
Yeah.
They're in concord and they celebrate one another's differences because they each occupy a unique space in eternity, like the lashes of an eye. Nibley comments, there is a hierarchy of brightness, the range going on forever, each more glorious than the next. The Ginza says that when beings from different worlds meet, they exchange garments and treasures as a sign of mutual esteem and identification. Talk about the expansiveness of the plan of salvation. We don't often
Yeah.
get, we talk about celestial glory, but we don't talk about what it's like to intermingle with other celestial worlds and beings.
Can I just say something else here? I'm gonna because I am a coarse individual in my thinking. I'm always looking for how this benefits us in the here and now. And there is something that has bugged me for a long time, Ken, and that is this idea of cultural appropriation, right?
Oh, yeah.
If we are seeking for unity, well, it kind of tells us how the worlds do it, right? They exchange garments and treasures as signs of mutual esteem and identification.
Yeah.
I think that debunks that thought, right? And being a simple guy who looks for simple answers to problems, I think again, and I've said this a lot on this podcast, and I really mean it. By nature, I'm a guy who wants to look forward for solutions and answers. But the truth is, sometimes we got to look back, right?
Well, yeah.
A lot of these problems that we face aren't new to humanity, right? But it's in the looking back that we go, oh, I see where we departed the track. This is where we left the plan. And I think this is another example of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, civilization today
Yeah,
is uh, built upon the achievements of the past. And if we were ignorant of that, we'd be reinventing the wheel every generation.
absolutely.
Yeah. The Pista Sophia, quote, other worlds cannot possibly be described in terms of this world. Not only is there less in common between other worlds and this world, they differ as widely among themselves as any of them does from
Mm.
us. In the limited confines of the flesh, the new and the new available writing of James explains, which condition all our thinking, we can't possibly grasp the nature of other existences or even begin to count the number of worlds.
Wow.
They differ more between themselves than they do between us and them. See, for me, that's so exciting.
Right.
And we'll read why, because this is cool. When we say light, says the Sophia Christi, quote, we think of our kind of light, unquote. But that's wrong. When we say marriage, for example, and this is Nibley talking, in the other world, it will be entirely different from what it is here. What in the
Mm.
heck? Though, of course, we must designate earthly and heavenly marriage by the same name. Even though spirits may be eternal and thus equal in age, this writing explains they differ in intelligence, in appearance, and in other things. What? And these differences are primary, as unbegotten as the spirits themselves.
Ooh.
Primary meaning they've always been.
Right.
It is not something that's acquired. We are just different, primary, and unbegotten, and no two alike.
Whoa, whoa,
Can you
whoa.
imagine?
Whoa,
Can
whoa,
you
whoa.
imagine Ken Peterson at age 27 reading that for the first time and going, duh?
Time out here. We are just different, primary, and unbegotten. That's an interesting word, right? Especially for us who follow the only begotten. There is some deep stuff there to unpack. Holy cow.
Well, and that's Abraham chapter 3, Doctrine and
Yep.
Covenants section 93, uncreated. We
Yep.
are nolam, we are eternal. Yeah. I mean, the essence of who we are. Yes, our physical bodies were. Yes, our spirit bodies were created for us, but all to house this primary independent intelligence that we have always been. Uh, the Lord tells the apostles in the epistle of the apostles, quote, where my Father is, it's entirely different from this world. There you will see lights that are nobler than your kind of light. In the
Mm.
millions of worlds that God has made for his Son, every world is different from the others and wonderful in its own radiance. Quoting the Odes of Solomon, quote, hence, one of the joys of existence is that the worlds constantly exchange with each other what they have, each possessing something different and peculiar to itself. There is nothing superfluous anywhere, which means that nothing is a mere duplication of something else, unquote, which helps me comprehend why creation is infinite.
Absolutely.
Because there's no copying anything, everything that becomes a part of God's kingdom is new, is
Hmm.
different. You may, Nibley says, you may wonder why we are not sharing the fun here on earth. That's because we have been quarantined. I hadn't thought of this probation being a quarantine
14.
situation.
That's an interesting word to use there.
He goes on, we've been isolated for a special testing situation. Remember, that's what the Lord told Enoch when he was talking about the world. He had created, quote, worlds without number, he's quoting Moses, and yet he told Enoch, among all the workmanship of my hands, there has not been so great wickedness as among thy brethren, unquote.
Mm. Mm.
So when you are here, you are getting a real test. They talk a lot about that, this test being so much harder. There are all kinds of strange beasts on other worlds that we can't even imagine. Joseph Smith talked about this.
Yeah.
He really nailed it. In some worlds, reproduction is carried out differently from here. The Zohar, perhaps the oldest Jewish writing known, says, quote, there are all sorts of creatures for all sorts of environments. Only man is the same everywhere, and yet he's the most individual of all. Unquote.
Mm.
That's wonderful, isn't it? All these creatures adapt themselves to different worlds, like the monsters of the past, dinosaurs, the Stegosaurus, and various creatures living on other geological ages. They had to adapt themselves. And in other worlds, uh, it could be the same thing. The most fantastic forms of life. Man is the only one that is the same everywhere because he adapts himself in a different way. He's the most different of all.
Wow.
The spirits, says the Sophia Christi newly found manuscript, are equal in age, but different in power, intelligence, and appearance, and have been so throughout all time. The devil has no real purpose. All he is trying to do is thwart someone else's purpose. He has no principle of action within himself. He is Apollyon, the destroyer, Satan, or Diabolos, the accuser.
You know, we see this pattern play out in Earth. If you go back to that other slide that we were just on, where it talks about the devil has no real purpose.
Correct.
I was sitting in a Western Civ class once, early when I was a young man, just going to college. And we were talking about Vikings and Nordic expansion. And the question was asked, well, what happened to them, right? Because they were fearless warriors, right? They would, and raiders is probably the better word for it, right?
Yep,
And
yep, yep.
what happened to them? Well, they kind of wore themselves out, right? There's only so much raiding you can do until you're forced to build something,
Yeah,
right?
it's
All
not
those kind of
sustainable.
activities are unsustainable. And and Satan and his minions are unsustainable, right? If their sole purpose is destruction, one, that could only possibly ever go on so far. But
Yep.
two, we also know God's not going to let it get that far either, right? And so understand that Satan's very existence is one which is almost guaranteed to end with some sort of dissolution.
Yeah. That's very, very good. That's a very good thought. I was looking, I don't know if I'm either I skipped it or missed it or something. One of the things that he quotes, and one of the ideas that has always stuck with me, is one of the joys of eternal existence is endless variety.
Hmm.
And
Which,
these quotes, they've been beating around it, and I must have missed the one where it actually states that. One of
which,
the joys of eternal existence is endless variety.
which it would have to be, right? I mean, look, I can't think of a more apt description of hell than just staring at the same thing over and over and over,
Oh, yeah, that would be hell for me for sure.
right? And so
Yeah.
that only makes sense.
Well, my friend, I there's more nibbly, but nothing. I haven't prepared any more nibbly. You still want more?
Well, look, we could we could we could do a 4 hour episode for each one of these books and never really touch any of them, right?
Yeah. Well, I hope this has given people kind of an overview of what's out there and doing a deep dive on some of these essays so you can see how far-reaching his mind is and his research is. Um, and I said before, but in preparing for these presentations, what struck me that I hadn't realized because I've been imbibing Hugh Nibley for 40 years is how much a part of my psychology his expoundings have become. That the reason I think the way I do, the reason I believe the way I do, is because of the profound influence his explanations have been on my life. As you see these like treasures in the heavens and unrolling the scrolls, and of course my own life's work is in the publication uh, of my book was a direct result of me being influenced by what Hugh Nibley was researching and saying and sharing.
Hmm.
Wow, who can you say that about? I am who I am. I think how I am in great measure because I was reading and being influenced deeply, profoundly by Hugh Nibley.
As I think about Nibley, and I think about the things that he brought forth, right? And not brought forth in terms of how Joseph Smith brought them forth, but
Right.
back to what we talked about in that first episode. He's the great expounder
Yes. Yes.
of these
Yes.
things. What he really is that he's a gift to, certainly to Mormonism and mankind,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because here's a guy who was blessed by God to have the mind that he had, that wasn't concerned with getting rich, with the things of this world. He was concerned with the knowledge of them. And the gifts that I think he left for Mormonism is, if you are someone that has to make sense of it up here and in the heart, he's your guy, right? He's your guy because he's going to show that you do stand on solid bedrock by
Yeah.
believing in the restoration. And likewise, he shows that our faith is an ancient faith restored, right?
Yes. Yep.
The other gift that I believe he's given to Mormonism is a far more expansive version of Mormonism than what we had been privy to up to that point,
Yeah.
unless you knew Brigham, or unless you knew certain people who were really well acquainted with them.
Yep.
I think one of the things that Nibley does so well through his research and through his insights into some of those ancient texts is to show that we don't have to be limited in our thinking when we talk about the gospel and when we think of,
Yeah.
and that is the gift of the restoration, and that's a gift that I think was reemphasized by Hugh Nibley.
When he would say, nothing inspires, or was it Joseph Smith? Nothing inspires men like the contemplation of the eternities.
Yep.
And you, and I get the sense from him and from his writings, this joy
Yeah.
when he expounds it. It's just fun, and it's almost like he's laughing when he says these things, and not laughing in a mocking sense, of course, but because it makes him joyful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Whew. And we only scratched the very, very surface, right? Like,
Wow, thanks a lot.
no, no, you know what I'm saying.
I know I'm messing with you.
You know what I'm saying. You know, look, I guess my hope is that people will, whether you're a mainstream LDS person or you're a fundamentalist, Nibley has something for you. Nibley has put in the work for you to benefit from when it comes to these deeper things and understanding the complex about the gospel and bringing them down in a way that is digestible and in a way that can be very applicable. And I just hope everyone takes the time necessary to at least give him a cursory reading, because if you do that, you're going to go deeper anyway. It's it's a far gone conclusion, but Ken, anything else you want to say in conclusion, bud?
Oh, just to reiterate, nothing excites men like the contemplation of the eternities. That is so, there's nothing in my life more exciting or that I enjoy talking about or sharing or listening or discussing more than this great plan of salvation, which expounded by people like Hugh Nibley and Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, Jack Welch, and others. Uh, it could take a rotten situation and flip it and make you feel, oh, I remember one of the things that Nibley said about if you truly understood the plan of salvation, you would shout hallelujah
Yep,
all the day long. So
absolutely.
even in hard times, we would understand. And this, so when God says he will never leave us, well, he's not here right now. Well, when you understand the whole plan, it's true. He's never, we are never utterly abandoned.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Ken, as always, dude, I love these talks. I love you. I love talking to you. And I can't wait for our next one.
Thanks, Dave. I always have a lot of fun. You're a great friend. I appreciate it.
You are to me as well, and I look forward to doing this again on Enoch. We're we'll tackle
Oh,
Enoch.
I'm excited already.
All right, all right. Thanks, Ken. Bye,
See ya.
everybody.